He built an empire on blood and silence. And the one woman the universe chose for him, he chained to an altar and offered to the dark. King Vaeric Draven sacrificed his fated mate to save a kingdom that was already rotting from the inside. He thought it would cost him one night of grief. He didn't know she would come back wearing the moon itself. If you've ever watched someone destroy the only thing that could have saved them, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments so I know who's watching this with me tonight. Let's begin. The chains they used on Selene Vaelor were not ordinary iron. They were forged from silver alloy, smelted in the western mines where the ore ran cold even in summer, where the mountain wolves refused to den because something in the rock repelled them. The castle's head priest had requisitioned 40 pounds of the metal 3 weeks before the Blood Eclipse arrived, and the smiths who shaped it into restraints wore gloves the entire time because the metal burned to the touch even without fire. Selene felt the cold of those chains the moment they sealed around her wrists. Not the cold of temperature, the cold of intent. She stood in the outer corridor of the Moon Temple's lower chamber, a room that had been a grain vault before someone draped it in black silk and carved ancient symbols into the floor. And she did not struggle. She had already understood 4 hours earlier when the royal guards arrived at her chamber without explanation, that struggling was not what this night required. What this night required was clarity. The corridor smelled of torch smoke and old stone, and the sweet medicinal reek of ritual herbs burning in bronze vessels along the walls. Priests moved around her in their dark robes, not meeting her eyes. They touched her shoulders and her arms to steer her forward, and their hands were careful, almost apologetic, the way hands are careful when the person they are touching is already condemned. Selene counted 7 of them. She counted the torches. 14. She counted her own heartbeats until she stopped counting and simply breathed. Her mother had taught her once, in the small stone cottage outside the capital where Selene spent her childhood, that the body knows fear before the mind admits it. The heart accelerates. The jaw tightens. The hands want to curl into fists or reach for something solid. Selene's hands hung in their chains and were still. She was afraid. She simply refused to let her body perform it for an audience. The door to the main chamber opened ahead of her, and the sound that came through was not the sound of ceremony. It was the sound of a court holding its breath. Hundreds of nobles packed the gallery above the ceremonial floor, crowded against carved balustrades in their finest formal wear, and not one of them made a sound as the priests guided Selene through the entrance. She counted them too. 200, perhaps more. Every major house represented. General Voss in the front row with his arms folded and his expression arranged into something between gravity and satisfaction. The royal council seated to his left, 3 of the 4 members showing the rigid stillness of men who had voted on something they were not proud of. The high emissary from the Eastern Territories standing near the rear columns with a delegation of foreign witnesses, because Vaeric had apparently decided that whatever this was, it required an audience from beyond the kingdom's borders. Selene filed that detail away. A king who performs his cruelty publicly either wants witnesses to his power or witnesses to his necessity. She was already deciding which one Vaeric Draven believed himself to be. The altar stood at the chamber's center on a raised platform of black marble veined with silver. It was shaped like a table, wide enough that a full-grown man could lie across it, and its surface was covered in carved symbols so old that no living scholar could translate them all. Channels were cut into the marble around its perimeter, shallow grooves that led to small drain points at each corner. The stones beneath those corners were stained darker than the rest. This altar had been used before. Not in living memory, not in recorded history, but the stains were there, and Selene's eyes found them immediately, and she understood without being told what those channels were designed to carry. She stopped walking. The priests at her sides pressed forward gently. "Keep moving," the elder priest murmured beside her ear. "I know what this is," Selene said. Her voice was quiet. It did not shake, but it carried in the chamber's stone acoustics the way any calm voice carries when everything around it is holding its breath. "I know exactly what this altar was built for." She looked up at the gallery. She found Vaeric Draven immediately. He stood slightly apart from the council, at the gallery's center where the carved balustrade was lowest, as if the architect had intended that particular vantage point for whoever ruled the room. He was dressed in ceremonial black, the formal collar of his office open at the throat in a way that suggested he had dressed in haste or had stopped caring partway through. His jaw was a hard line. His eyes were fixed on her with an expression that she spent 2 full seconds trying to name before settling on the only accurate word. Controlled, not cold, not indifferent, not cruel. Controlled. The distinction mattered, because indifference would have been simpler to survive. "King Draven," she said. The chamber responded to her voice by becoming even quieter than it already was, which should not have been possible. "I would like you to look at me while you do this." Nothing moved in his face. "I would like the man who sentenced me to look at me directly, and I would like him to keep looking because I will not give you the mercy of my eyes being closed." A murmur moved through the gallery above. General Voss shifted his weight slightly. Vaeric said nothing. He was looking directly at her. He had not looked away since she entered. The priest guided her to the altar steps, and Selene climbed them without being forced to, because there was a difference between being dragged to a thing and choosing to face it, and she had already decided which version of herself this night would record. They positioned her against the altar's edge. The chains at her wrists were attached to anchor rings embedded in the stone, and when the senior priest secured them, the click of metal was a sound she felt more than heard, a small mechanical conclusion that sealed something she could not yet name. She looked up at the ceiling. The chamber had no roof, or rather, the roof had been opened at its center, a rectangular aperture cut through 3 feet of stone to expose the sky above. Through it, she could see the eclipse in progress, the moon in its blood phase, deep amber red at its edges and darkening toward ochre at its face, and the stars arranged around it like an audience at their own spectacle. She thought of her mother's cottage. She thought of the dog that used to sleep at the door in winter, enormous and gray and unreliable in all things except warmth. She thought of nothing at all for several seconds, which was its own kind of survival. The elder priest began the ritual words, ancient syllables that moved through the chamber like water moving through underground channels, old, purposeful, indifferent to any individual caught in their path. Other priests lit incense from the bronze vessels and carried the smoke toward the altar in slow ceremonial arcs. Selene watched the eclipse through the open ceiling. She felt, somewhere at the edge of her consciousness, at the furthest reach of sensation, the way you feel weather changing through walls, the mate bond. 3 months. They had been formally bound as mates for 3 months, and in those 3 months Vaeric Draven had spoken to her perhaps 40 times. Not brief acknowledgments across a formal dinner, but actual directed speech with the expectation of response. 40 times in 90 days. She had kept count because counting things was how she made sense of spaces that did not make sense, and the space between her and her mate had never made sense. She had understood early that his coldness was not a personality but a policy. He had built the coldness deliberately, brick by careful brick, over years of ruling a kingdom that tested his edges every waking moment. She had even, in her more honest moments alone at night, understood why. She had seen the court, had seen the way every moment of visible softness became a target immediately, had seen subordinates read kindness as weakness and weakness as opportunity. She had understood all of it. She had still hoped, in the illogical way that hope operates when the body says mate and the heart agrees, that 40 conversations in 90 days was a beginning rather than a limit. Now the chains were cold around her wrists, and the priests were speaking ancient words, and the eclipse was happening overhead, and she had her answer about whether it had been a beginning. "Selene." The voice came from the gallery. It was not loud, but it cut through the ritual chanting with the precision of a blade finding a seam in armor, because Vaeric Draven spoke with the controlled compression of a man who had spent years ensuring that when he chose to speak, it penetrated. She looked up at him. 40 feet above her, separated by the gallery railing and 3 months of silence and whatever he had told himself was wisdom, he looked at her with that expression she had named controlled, and she saw, for just a fraction of a second, the way a fault line shows itself in a wall only when the right angle of light hits it, that the control was costing him something. She held his gaze. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "Don't." His jaw tightened fractionally. "I'm not going to beg," she continued. I'm not going to tell you that this is a mistake because I think somewhere you already know it is, and you've decided the alternative is worse. I'm not going to ask you to choose me because you already made that choice, and explaining to me why won't change the chains. A long pause. Then what do you want? Vaeric said. I want you to remember this, she said. Not the politics of it, not the necessity of it, the actual moment. Me. Here. What I look like from up there when I'm not begging you to stop. Something moved through his face that she could not interpret. I want you to carry that, she said, for as long as you live, however long that turns out to be after tonight. Vaeric was quiet for a count of 3. I already know I will, he said. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and it arrived at the worst possible time, the way the most honest things tend to arrive. The ritual intensified around her. The priest's voices rose in unison, overlapping syllables building on each other in a pattern that resonated somewhere below ordinary hearing, a frequency that seemed to come from the stone itself rather than from human throats. The eclipse above the aperture reached its fullest depth, the moon going dark red, almost black at its center, the sky around it a shade of night so complete that the stars looked like holes rather than sources of light. Selene felt the altar's surface grow warm beneath her hands. Not the warmth of stone absorbing body heat. Something else. Something coming up from underneath, from whatever the altar's deep channels connected to, from whatever ancient intention had been carved into its foundation centuries before anyone present had been born. The senior priest stepped to the altar's head with a ceremonial blade. Selene had already looked at the blade when the priest brought it out during preparation. She had assessed it the way she assessed everything in this room, practically, without sentiment. The blade was silver, narrow, designed for a clean incision rather than anything more violent. The ritual required blood. The altar required blood. Whatever was written in the ancient texts that Vaeric's seers had resurrected required blood, and specifically hers, and specifically tonight beneath this eclipse. She understood all of it. She still flinched when the blade touched her palm. Not from pain. The cut was shallow, skilled, from something more fundamental than pain. The body's oldest objection to violation, the one that does not respond to logic or resolve or carefully built composure. Her blood hit the altar's silver-veined surface, and the world came apart. Not metaphorically, not in the way that people describe significant moments as world-ending when they mean emotionally significant. The chamber walls cracked, not small hairline fractures, 3-foot sections of ancient stone split laterally as if something underground had shifted, as if the foundation of the building had suddenly remembered it was built on living rock and the rock had an opinion. The torches went out. All 14 of them, simultaneously, without smoke, without flickering, simply extinguished as if the darkness had made a decision. The eclipse above the aperture, the blood moon at the apex of its fullness, did something that had no word in any language currently spoken in the kingdom. The light changed, not dimmed, not brightened, changed in character, in quality, in what it was. The red-amber glow became something silver-white, and then became something that had no color in the ordinary spectrum, something that the eye registered as light only because the alternative was impossible. The silver light fell directly through the aperture. It fell directly on Selene. She felt it hit her the way you feel a wave that is larger than you expected, not just against the surface, but through it. A pressure that was not physical pressure, a recognition that moved in the opposite direction of thought, that arrived in the body before the mind could frame it, that said in no human language but in something older and more absolute than language. Yes. There. That one. She heard a sound she could not locate. It was her own voice, she realized distantly. She was speaking in a language she did not know. Words came from her throat that she had never learned, syllables in a pattern that her tongue shaped without her instruction, and the sound of those words hit the chamber's stone walls and returned changed, returned amplified, returned as something that was no longer just sound, but was also light and pressure, and the sudden sharp awareness of every person in the gallery above staring down at her as the silver markings bloomed across her skin. She looked at her hands. Ancient symbols traced in silver fire crossed her palms where the blade had cut, and spread upward along her wrists, along her forearms, climbing with the unhurried certainty of something that had always been there, and had only required the correct catalyst to become visible. The chains shattered. Not slowly, not dramatically. With the complete indifference of something trivial, the way frost cracks in spring, the way old wood gives, the way things made by human hands respond when something beyond human calculation decides they are no longer useful. Selene's knees would not hold her. She went down to the altar's surface, and her hands spread flat on the marble, and the silver light poured through her palms into the stone, and the stone lit from within, and the drain channels that had been carved to carry blood began to carry light instead. Silver white and searing, running in every direction across the chamber floor in the pattern of the ancient symbols, tracing the entire geometry of the ritual space in fire that gave no heat. The priests scattered, several ran, 2 fell to their knees. The elder priest backed against the far wall and held his ceremonial blade against his chest with both hands, as if the blade might protect him, which was the most human response in the room, the most understandable form of reaching for something solid when everything solid had stopped being reliable. Selene was aware of the gallery above her. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a wound once the shock begins to clear, not immediately, not with sharp focus, but with the slow gathering clarity of sensation that shock had briefly suspended. She heard the sounds above her, shouts, the crash of a nobleman stumbling backward against the railing, the distinctive sound of someone wealthy and unaccustomed to running beginning to run. She raised her eyes to the gallery, to the center point of the carved balustrade where Vaeric Draven stood. He had not moved. Every other noble in the gallery had pressed backward or sideways. Several were actively leaving toward the exit corridors. The foreign delegation from the Eastern Territories was in full retreat, the High Emissary caught between the instinct to maintain dignity and the instinct to be significantly farther from whatever was happening on the chamber floor. Vaeric stood at the railing and looked down at her. He looked down at her the way you look at a thing that you knew was coming and chose to disbelieve until it arrived. His face had lost the controlled expression. It had lost all expression, actually, which was different from losing feeling. Selene understood the difference between a face that felt nothing and a face that felt too many things simultaneously to settle on a single expression for others to read. His hands were on the railing. His knuckles had gone white. Selene was aware that the silver light was still moving through her, aware that the ancient symbols had continued their slow climb up her shoulders, across her collarbone, up the sides of her throat, aware that the ruins of the chains lay on the altar beside her like discarded metal, meaning nothing now. She was aware of all of it. She was looking at him. "You wanted to save the kingdom," she said. Her voice had changed. She heard the change herself. It was not her voice alone anymore. It was her voice and something underneath it, a resonance that belonged to the chamber and to the eclipse and to whatever the silver light was carrying. "You wanted to preserve the empire." She stood. The act of standing was not an act of effort. Her body rose with the completeness of something restored rather than recovered, not the shaky uprightness of someone who has survived a violent thing, but the full, grounded presence of something that has arrived at exactly the place it was always traveling toward. "I hope," she said, looking up at him, "that the empire was worth it." The moon through the aperture above her reached the absolute zenith of the eclipse. The light that came down through that aperture was no longer moonlight in any ordinary sense. Every wolf in the kingdom fell. Selene did not know this yet. She would learn it later, that from the capital to the eastern border, from the mountain territories to the coastal cities, every wolf-blooded person in Stormfire Kingdom dropped to the ground simultaneously at the moment the silver light poured through the temple aperture. Warriors mid-patrol, children asleep, farmers in their beds, the Alpha clans in their war halls. They went down the way things go down when a greater gravity asserts itself, not violently, not with damage, but with the totality of a tide. The thing that came through the aperture was not light, it was recognition. And the recipient of that recognition stood on an ancient altar in the kingdom's broken temple and looked up at the man who had put her there and felt something shift in her chest that was not grief exactly and not fury exactly, and was not hope. Hope was the wrong word, and had been the wrong word for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. The word for what she felt was simpler, becoming. She was becoming something. And whatever it was, it had begun the moment her blood touched the stone, and the chains had shattered in its wake. And the eclipse had answered, And even now, as the gallery above emptied of the human noise of a court, discovering it had made a catastrophic error in judgment, the becoming continued with the indifference of deep water regarding a stone dropped into it. Selene looked at the marks on her arms. She looked at the silver fire still tracing the floor of the chamber in patterns that matched exactly, she was now certain, the engravings on the altar, the engravings on the walls, the ancient records that Vaeric's seers had pulled from the royal vaults to justify what they told him would save the kingdom. She looked up at him again. "The temples," she said quietly. "The dead temples." Vaeric had not moved. "How many are there?" she said. A pause. His voice, when it came, was flat and stripped of the controlled register he usually maintained. Stripped the way a blade is stripped when the formal sheath is lost and the thing itself is what you're holding. 11, he said. 11 temples across the kingdom, all collapsed or abandoned. She looked at the silver fire spreading along the chamber floor. She watched it reach the walls. She watched it find the seams in the stone where mortar had crumbled and where the foundation's oldest layers were exposed, and she watched it travel through those seams outward, through the walls, following whatever network of stone and buried channels connected this chamber to the wider structure beneath the city. "How far to the nearest of the others?" she said. Vaeric did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had something in it she had not heard from him before. Not fear, something more specific than fear. "Half a mile," he said. "The northern remnant. What's left of the first temple? It's been ash and rubble for 200 years. Selene watched the silver fire travel through the walls. "Not anymore," she said. The ground moved, not violently, not a collapse or a rupture. A deep, settling acknowledgement from the stone beneath the city. The kind of movement that happens when something long dormant concludes that the conditions it required have finally been met. Far away, at a distance Selene could not yet perceive with her senses, but could feel with whatever the silver light had opened in her, something ancient and enormous straightened itself in the dark. The northern remnant began to breathe. Vaeric's hands left the railing. He looked at them. Then he looked at the chamber floor, where the silver fire was still running its patterns across the stone. Then he looked at Selene. "What are you?" he said. Not an accusation. Not even a question. It had the texture of a man working out aloud something he already partially knew and was testing to hear whether hearing it spoken changed its weight. Selene looked at the marks on her skin. She looked at her hands. She thought about the answer. She thought about how, 6 months ago, she had been a merchant's daughter from a border city who had been informed by the royal seers that she was the Alpha King's fated mate and had been brought to the capital and had been placed in a court that regarded her as insufficient and peripheral, and had spent 3 months watching her mate govern an empire with precision and ferocity while addressing her fewer times per week than he addressed his stable hands. She thought about how all of that had led here, to silver fire and broken chains and the dead temples breathing. "I think," Selene said slowly, "that I am the thing your kingdom destroyed everything trying to reach." She looked up at him. "And I think you just made me remember it." The ground moved again. Longer, deeper, resonant, a vibration that moved up through the floor into the altar beneath her hands and into her bones and into whatever the silver markings were still doing in her blood. From the northern quarter of the capital came a sound that the sleeping city would later describe in 100 different ways, like stone speaking, like music without pitch, like the sound of something vast slowly opening its eyes. The first temple was awake. And in the gallery above a cracked and fire-lit ceremonial chamber, King Vaeric Draven gripped the edge of the railing and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only when it is too late for the understanding to change what has already been done, that he had not saved the kingdom tonight. He had woken something sleeping inside it, something that wore the face of the woman he had chained to an altar, something that was looking up at him now with silver eyes he did not recognize, and something, in the deepest, most honest, most ungovernable part of himself, had leaned forward the instant those eyes found his, the mate bond surging with a violence that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with the simple catastrophic fact that she was standing there and breathing and had not broken, had not begged, had not given him the mercy of his guilt being something he could manage from a distance. She was there. She was awake. And in 11 dead temples across a kingdom that had just run out of distance between itself and whatever was coming, the lights came on. The night the 11 temples woke, no one in the capital slept. Not by choice. Not from awe. Though awe was present in the way that weather is present. Something you do not decide to feel, but simply find yourself inside. The wolves of Stormfire Kingdom had collapsed simultaneously at the moment of the eclipse's zenith, and when they rose again, seconds later, for some, closer to a minute for others, they rose changed, not visibly. Nothing so obvious as a physical alteration. But in the way that a room is changed when something significant has occurred in it, a residue of shifted atmosphere that the body reads before the mind can articulate the source. Every wolf-blooded person in the kingdom woke from that collapse with silver at the edges of their vision. It faded within the hour for most of them. For the Alpha clans, it did not fade at all. In the capital's ceremonial district, the guards who had stood post outside the Moon Temple found the building cracked along its northern wall, light leaking from the fractures in a color that had no business coming from inside a stone structure. They sent a runner to the garrison commander, who sent a rider to the royal council, who sent 3 separate messengers to the king's private chambers and received no response from any of them because Vaeric Draven was not in his chambers. He was still in the gallery above the chamber floor, still at the railing, still looking at the woman below, who no longer looked the way she had looked when this night began. The last priest had fled 20 minutes ago. The nobles had emptied from the gallery in stages, first the foreigners, then the most politically pragmatic of the domestic houses, then the ones who stayed out of a conviction that remaining visible during a crisis was its own form of leverage, and then finally even those, when the ground moved the second time and did not stop for nearly 30 seconds. Vaeric and Selene were alone, 40 feet of vertical stone between them, and alone. He had not moved from the railing because moving felt like a decision he was not ready to make, and he had not survived 20 years of ruling a kingdom at war by making decisions before he understood the terrain. The terrain had changed. The terrain was, in fact, unrecognizable. And the woman standing at its center in silver light had just told him that she was the thing his kingdom destroyed everything trying to reach, and he was still processing the architecture of that sentence. "Come down," Selene said. Not a request. Not a command, exactly. The tone of someone establishing a fact about what was going to happen next. Vaeric's hands left the railing. He moved to the gallery's interior staircase and descended without hurry, because hurrying would have communicated something about his internal state that he had no intention of communicating, and because whatever was waiting for him at the bottom of those stairs, he intended to meet it standing straight. He pushed through the chamber door. The floor was still warm beneath his boots. The silver light had dimmed from the intensity of the eclipse's peak, but had not vanished. It ran in faint veins through the carved channels in the stone, a residual glow that made the chamber look like a diagram of something's circulatory system. The broken chains on the altar caught it and scattered it in small, cold pieces across the marble surface. Selene stood 6 feet from the altar's base. She was watching him cross the chamber toward her with the particular quality of attention that he associated with experienced commanders assessing the approach of another force. Not hostility, not warmth. Calculation. The kind that happens when someone is measuring what they're dealing with and has not yet decided what to do with the measurement. The silver markings on her skin had faded to something visible only when the veined light in the floor moved beneath her, a shimmer rather than an illumination, evidence rather than demonstration. He stopped 4 feet from her. He looked at her hands. The cut on her palm from the ritual blade had sealed itself. No scab, no rawness, simply closed, as if the blade had never found it. "Say what you're thinking," Selene said. "I'm thinking several things." "Pick one." His jaw shifted. "What happened to you tonight? The light, the markings, the temples? I need to understand the scope of it before either of us moves from this room." "You need," she repeated. "Yes." "You need," she said again, and the word had a texture the second time, a specificity to the way she shaped it. "That's an interesting word for tonight, given the context." "I'm aware of the context." "Are you?" It was not a question. Because context is the thing that tells you what a word actually means. And the context tonight is that you chained me to that altar and let your priests cut my hand so my blood would fall on the stone and satisfy whatever was written in those ancient texts your seers dug out of the vaults. And the word you're opening with is need. Vaeric held her gaze. Yes, he said again. Something moved in her face. Not anger. She was past the kind of anger that showed itself easily. This was the cooler register that lives on the other side of fury, where a person has processed the heat of a thing and what remains is the refined, durable version. Then ask, she said, since you need. What are you now? I don't fully know yet. What do you know? She looked at her hands again. A long pause. He had learned in their 3 months of minimal interaction that her pauses were not uncertainty. They were selection. She was deciding what to offer and what to keep, and the pause was the work of that decision. I know the temples are awake, she said. All 11. I can feel them the way you feel rooms in your own house without looking. Not consciously, but present. Like they're there and I know they're there and they know I know. What does that mean for the kingdom? I don't know yet. Best estimate. She looked at him directly. My best estimate is that it means whatever the moon goddess originally built them to mean. Whatever that was before they were abandoned, before the wars, before whoever ruled this kingdom 200 years ago decided they were inconvenient, which means my best estimate requires knowing what that original purpose was. A pause. Which means it requires your vaults. My vaults. The ancient records your seers used to justify this ritual. I want to see the full texts, not whatever interpretation they fed you. Vaeric studied her. There was a version of this conversation in which he reminded her that she was in his kingdom, standing in his temple, technically still his bound mate regardless of what the Eclipse had decided about her other properties. There was a version in which he reasserted the geometry of the situation as it had existed before tonight. He looked at the broken chains on the altar. He looked at the faint silver running through the floor channels. That version of the conversation was no longer available. You'll have access to the vaults, he said. Now. In the morning, when... Now, Vaeric. He stopped. She had used his name before, formally, in court settings, in the few conversations they'd had in private. She had always used it with a careful modulation, the specific calibration of someone who is aware that they are speaking to a king and is neither cowering from the fact nor performing ease around it. She used it differently now. Not disrespectfully, precisely. The way you use a key when you're not asking permission to open a door, but simply opening it. The mate bond in his chest, which had been tearing at the edges since the moment the ritual began and had reached something close to unbearable at the moment the chains shattered, was doing something he did not have vocabulary for now. Not pulling, not aching, pressing, forward and warm and uncomfortably certain, the way the body gets certain about things that the mind is still refusing to settle. Now, he said. They walked through the cracked temple corridors in silence. The guards at the outer door straightened as Vaeric passed and then stared openly at Selene with the stunned quality of men who had heard the sounds and felt the ground move and seen the light through the temple walls and were now watching the source of all of it walk out on her own feet, wearing silver that had not been there 3 hours ago. Vaeric did not explain. He never explained to guards. The capital's streets at this hour were the particular kind of emptied that cities get when something has frightened them, not abandoned, because people cannot resist windows, and every window they passed showed the shapes of people watching. The wolves who had been felled by the eclipse's peak had recovered and returned to their lives with the shaken efficiency of those who have experienced a thing they cannot categorize. They would talk about it tomorrow. They would categorize it inaccurately and argue about those inaccuracies for months. Tonight they watched from windows. The royal vaults occupied 3 underground levels beneath the palace's eastern wing. The seers had their own access corridor, which meant their own key, which meant that the full texts they had shown Vaeric had passed through their editorial attention first. Vaeric was aware of this. He had been aware of it when he made the decision. He had weighed the partial translation against the alternatives and found the alternatives worse. This was what ruling looked like from the inside. Not the clean certainty of right choices, But the grinding mathematics of least worst options, calculated in real time with incomplete information, bearing the consequences in full while the men who gave you the incomplete information stood at a safe remove. He opened the vault's main door with his own key. The corridor below was stone and oil lamp, cool and dry the way old document storage requires. The seers had requisitioned the text from the third level, the oldest section where the shelf markers were in an archaic script that only 2 people in the kingdom could still read. Selene looked at the shelves, then she moved to the third level without being directed. Vaeric watched her descend. She moved through the lower stacks with the focused efficiency of someone who was not browsing but locating, her hand trailing along the shelf edges until she stopped at a section marked with symbols that matched the ones that had appeared on her skin during the ritual. She pulled 3 heavy volumes. She carried them to the reading table without asking where the reading table was, because she had walked directly to it. Vaeric stood at the table's opposite end with his arms crossed, and watched her open the first volume and begin reading. "You can read that script?" he said. "Apparently." She did not look up. "That script hasn't been read by a living person in Vaeric." "What?" "Let me read." He let her read. He had governed a kingdom at war for 20 years and developed the patience that governance requires, the ability to wait without performing the waiting, to hold position without fidgeting or filling silence. He used that now. He sat at the table's far end and watched the oil lamps and listened to the sound of pages turning. 20 minutes passed, then 40. Then Selene set the third volume down with a precise care that he recognized as controlled agitation, the way someone handles an object when what they want to do with their hands is something other than handle objects carefully. "They knew," she said. "Who?" "Your seers. They knew what these texts actually say." She put her palm flat on the open page. "They told you the ritual required a mate sacrifice to seal the kingdom against a coming darkness. That's what you were told?" "That's what I was told." That's one sentence out of 40 pages of text. The part they omitted is the part that explains what a mate sacrifice actually does to the goddess vessel. He was very still. "Which is what?" he said. "It doesn't seal anything." She looked up at him. "It wakes her. The ritual is an activation sequence, not a containment measure. The blood on the altar is the catalyst. All the famine, the soulless wolves, the black rivers. The text calls those the dormancy symptoms. The signs that a vessel has been living too long unawakened. The darkness that's supposedly coming. It's drawn to dormancy, to divine power unlit and unguarded, like predators are drawn to stillness." Vaeric processed this. "The seers told me the famine would stop if the ritual was completed." "The famine will stop," Selene said, "because the vessel has awakened. The text is accurate about the outcome. It omitted everything about the means and the mechanism and the fact that the sacrifice is not the vessel's death. It's the vessel's beginning." A long silence. "They let me believe I was killing you," Vaeric said. "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him with an expression he could not read precisely, but which contained in its architecture something that was not quite contempt and was not quite pity, and sat in the space between them as its own category. Why would a group of men with exclusive control over the kingdom's sacred knowledge and the king's ear want the king to believe his mate was being sacrificed rather than transformed into something significantly more powerful than him? The silence that followed was the kind that arrives after a sentence has rearranged the furniture of a room. Vaeric uncrossed his arms. He thought about the senior seer, Aldrich, 20 years in the order, present at every major council decision since Vaeric's father's reign. Thought about the moment Aldrich had placed the translated texts on his desk and told him, quietly and with the gravity of a man delivering unwanted news with the reluctant honesty of the faithful, that the ancient records were clear, that the ritual required it, that there was no alternative. He thought about the expression on Aldrich's face. He had read it as sorrow. He reread it now as something else. "Where is Aldrich?" he said. "I would very much like to know that too," Selene said. Vaeric moved to the vault's speaking tube, an old communication system built into the wall for exactly this kind of below-ground necessity, and opened the channel to the guard captain's post. "Find the head seer," he said into the tube. Bring him to the vault reading room. Don't announce it. A pause from the other end. My king, the head seer left the capital. When? We received the departure record 2 hours ago, sir. He and 4 of the junior seers departed through the western gate shortly before the eclipse. Destination listed as the border archives. Standard notation. Vaeric closed the speaking tube. He stood with his hand still on the wall. 2 hours ago, Selene said from the table, not a question. 2 hours ago. Before the ritual concluded. Before. So before the eclipse reached its peak, before the chains broke, before any of the events of tonight that would have required him to explain himself to you. Vaeric turned from the wall. His face was doing the thing it did when he was moving past anger into the operational register. The register where feeling became fuel, and fuel became decision, and decision became action with a directness that the court had spent 20 years describing as the Iron Wolf's temperament, and he had spent 20 years cultivating because it was the only mode in which the kingdom's perpetual crises became solvable. He planned the departure before tonight, Vaeric said. He planned the departure knowing tonight would go the way it went, Selene corrected. Because he wrote tonight. He brought you the texts. He translated them selectively. He scheduled the ritual date. He chose the altar. Every element of tonight that you believe you decided with information he curated. Vaeric looked at her. The mate bond in his chest was doing something uncomfortable now. Uncomfortable in a specific way. The way discomfort operates when it is honest rather than strategic, when the body is registering a truth the mind has not fully caught up to. He had chained her to an altar. He had watched them cut her palm. He had stood at the railing and told her that he would carry the memory of it, and he had meant it as a kind of austere acknowledgement of the cost he was choosing to bear, and he had believed in that moment that he was bearing it for the kingdom. He had been a lever, a very powerful, very capable, very thorough lever, applied with precision by a hand he had not thought to question because the hand had been in the room for 2 decades and had never given him obvious reason to. Aldrich has been the head seer for 20 years, he said. Yes. What does he want? I don't know yet. She turned back to the texts. But I know what he doesn't want. He doesn't want me awake. He doesn't want the temples lit. And he doesn't want you and me in the same room after tonight with access to the full record of what the ritual actually does. He underestimated the outcome. He underestimated me, she said flatly. He expected the ritual to produce a confused, frightened woman with unexplained markings who would be immediately sequestered by the palace physicians while you managed the political fallout. He expected the awakening to be quiet and containable. He was working from a plan that required me to be disoriented. She tapped the open page. He didn't read this part carefully enough, she said. The vessel doesn't wake disoriented. The text is specific. The vessel wakes with accumulated memory. Not recovered, not glimpsed, accumulated. Everything the original held. Every war, every governance decision, every wolf clan that knelt and every one that burned. Vaeric was very quiet. How much do you remember? He said. She looked at him. A long pause. Enough, she said, to know that the last Alpha King who put chains on my wrists is not someone whose name anyone in this kingdom currently says out loud. The oil lamps between them made small sounds in the silence that followed. Vaeric pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Not a retreat. A decision. The decision of a man who has identified the moment where the old geometry of a conversation is no longer useful and something else is required. He put his forearms on the table and leaned forward slightly, which in his personal vocabulary of posture was the position he used when he was about to negotiate something that mattered. Tell me what you need, he said. Selene's eyes moved to his face. I just told you I have the accumulated memory of the last civilization that was built on a divine governance structure, she said. And your first move is to ask me what I need from you. It's not a move. Everything a king says to someone he put in chains 6 hours ago is a move. Then take it as whatever it is and answer it. She studied him the way she had studied the texts, not with hostility, but with the thoroughness of someone who was deciding what was accurate before proceeding. The texts describe something that's been written over in every official history your kingdom maintains, she said. The darkness coming from the north. The army older than wolf civilization. The dormancy symptoms in the kingdom were the early signal. The darkness is drawn to divine absence, and the absence has been here for 200 years since the temples went cold. How long before it arrives? The texts aren't specific about timelines, but the symptoms we've been living through, the famine, the soulless births, the black rivers, those are described as the final stage before arrival, which means weeks, possibly less. Not months. Vaeric absorbed this. And the 11 temples. They're awake now, which means the absent signal has been replaced. Whatever was navigating toward it will now be navigating toward something else. Toward you. Toward the light, she said, which currently lives here. A long beat. Then we need defenses across 11 points of the kingdom simultaneously, Vaeric said. And we need them before whatever is coming decides the light is a target rather than a deterrent. We, Selene said. The word sat between them. Not warm, not cold. A test of itself. Whether it meant anything, whether he was using it as a tactical inclusion, or whether it reflected something actual. Yes, he said. We. You understand what you're saying. I understand that I need your knowledge of those texts and your connection to the temples, and you need my armies and my knowledge of the kingdom's military geography, and neither of those things is optional, given what's coming. He met her eyes steadily. That's what I'm saying. That's the pragmatic version. It's the honest version. She was quiet for a moment. And the version where you had me chained to an altar 6 hours ago. Is the version we both have to live with, he said. I can't unmake it. I won't insult you by trying to explain it into something other than what it was. I believed what I was told. I should have... He stopped. Restarted. I should have questioned the source. I didn't. That is on me, and it stays on me, and no amount of tactical honesty about what we need from each other going forward changes that. The silence this time was different, not the silence of two people in opposition. The silence of two people in the same room with the same impossible set of facts, working out where to stand. The council will convene by morning, Selene said finally, when they learn Aldrich has fled. They'll convene before morning. And their position on tonight. Their position will be whatever position they calculate serves their houses best, Vaeric said, which, now that the temples are lit and you're walking around with divine markings and the eclipse has been recorded by every noble with functioning eyes, may shift several times before dawn. Malric Voss, she said. His expression changed fractionally. What about him? He was in the gallery, front row. I saw his face when the chains broke. She looked at Vaeric directly. He didn't look frightened. He looked like someone whose timing had changed. Vaeric was still. The mate bond pressed forward in his chest with that warm, insistent quality that he was no longer pretending was not there. He had been pretending it was not there for 3 months. The pretense had served a specific function. He had governed longer than most kings by keeping the things that could compromise his judgment at a controlled distance. Attachment compromised judgment. The mate bond, if he let it operate at full weight, would compromise his judgment. He had understood this and had managed accordingly. What he had not understood, what the seers had removed from the texts, along with everything else they had removed, was that the management had a ceiling. That you could keep a thing at distance only until the thing decided the distance was over. The distance was over. Voss has been building a coalition, Vaeric said. The past 2 months. I've been watching it. The minor houses he's been meeting with, the gifts to the military families with alpha sons. You were watching and you didn't move on it. I was watching because moving too early is worse than watching. An accusation without evidence gives him the narrative. And now he has a narrative without me providing it. Vaeric stood, a king who sacrificed his divine mate. An awakened goddess with reason for grievance. A head seer who fled the city before the ritual concluded. He looked at the vault ceiling as if calculating what was above them. 3 floors of palace, then the royal council's chambers, then the night sky where the eclipse was already passing its peak. By morning, Voss will have constructed a version of tonight in which every element serves his claim. Then we don't give him the morning, Selene said. She stood. She put the 3 volumes under her arm. I want scribes, she said. A full translation team for the rest of the vault. Not the Seers people. Anyone from the Seers network is potentially compromised. Find me scholars who have no connection to Aldrich's order. At this hour? Yes, at this hour. She looked at him with an expression that was not impatience, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone who has recalibrated the morning's timeline and found the available pace inadequate. The darkness doesn't wait for a reasonable hour. Voss doesn't wait for a reasonable hour. Aldrich fled at what I assume was a very reasonable hour for his purposes. The morning is already being used by everyone who intends to use us, which means we cannot save the morning for sleeping. Vaeric looked at her. The woman who had stood at the altar with her wrists in silver chains and refused to beg, refused to close her eyes, told him to carry the memory and meant it as a weight he deserved. She was standing in his vault at 3 a.m. with ancient texts under her arm telling him the morning had already begun. He had spent 3 months managing the mate bond. He was aware that what he felt looking at her now was not something that could be managed. It could be used, directed, applied, channeled into the operational register where it became another form of fuel. That was not the same as managing it. "I'll have the scholars woken," he said. "Good." They moved toward the vault stairs. She went first, which was not deference. She simply moved when she was ready to move and did not wait for him to organize the exit, and he followed because it was his palace and he knew the path, and also because watching her move through his space with that absolute absence of the performance of uncertainty was doing something to the mate bond that was becoming increasingly difficult to treat as background. At the staircase's first landing, she stopped. He nearly walked into her. She was looking at the wall to her left, a section of plain stone, unremarkable, no different from the 100 other plain stone walls in the palace's lower levels. Except a hairline seam ran through it. New, not old. Fresh fracture in old stone. And in the fracture, so faint it was almost not there. Silver. "This wall," Selene said. "Storage corridor," Vaeric said. "Nothing beyond it, but there's a temple section under this wing," she said. "Original foundation, pre-palace construction." "That's not possible. The palace was built on a temple that someone wanted to forget was there," she said. "Which makes 12. Not 11. She pressed her palm flat against the faint silver seam. The hairline fracture widened, not violently, with the slow inevitability of something that had been waiting for exactly this contact, exactly this recognition from exactly this hand. Light bled through the stone, silver and certain and absolutely without question. Vaeric stared at the wall. Selene turned to look at him, and her eyes had that luminous edge again, not fully silver, not the full awakening intensity of the eclipse peak, but present, lit from somewhere. "The Seers built their headquarters above a buried temple," she said quietly. The air between them shifted. "Aldrich didn't flee to the border archives," Vaeric said. "No," she said. "He fled to whatever is under this wing. Or he fled because whatever is under this wing woke up tonight along with the others, and he knew we would find it. And whatever he's been doing in the space above a buried divine site for 20 years was not something he wanted found." The silver light in the fracture pulsed once, and then again, like a signal, or a warning. From somewhere above them, not outside, not in the streets, but inside the palace, in the east wing directly overhead, came the sound of a door opening that should not have been able to open, because Vaeric had sealed that corridor 2 years ago after the East Wing renovations, and no one had the key but him. The sound of boots on stone, more than one person, moving quickly. Vaeric's hand went to the blade at his side, the one he carried always, the one that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with 20 years of surviving people who wanted him dead. Selene put her hand on his arm, not to stop him. She put her palm against his forearm, the way you lay a hand on something you intend to claim, with a flatness and a certainty that communicated ownership without performing it. "Don't," she said. The word was very quiet. "Whoever is in that corridor," she said, "they came for the wall, not for you." The boots above them stopped. Directly overhead, the silver in the fracture went dark, and in the absolute silence that followed from the sealed East Wing corridor where no one should have been, where a door that required Vaeric's personal key had somehow opened, Someone said Aldrich's name, not calling it, reporting to it. Vaeric moved first, not toward the staircase that led up to the east wing corridor where the boots had stopped, toward the vault's secondary passage, a narrow service tunnel cut into the western wall during the palace's third expansion, wide enough for one person, designed for the rapid movement of documents between the lower archive and the royal study without crossing the main corridors. He had built his survival on knowing every secondary passage in every building he occupied. This was not paranoia. This was arithmetic. A king who knew only the main corridors was a king who could be predicted, and a king who could be predicted was a king with a measurable lifespan. "This way," he said. Selene did not ask where it led. She moved. The tunnel was unlit and smelled of old paper and damp stone, and Vaeric navigated it from memory alone. 43 steps, left turn, 7 more, the low ceiling section where he ducked automatically, the door at the end with the latch that required lifting before turning because the frame had settled 2 winters ago, and no one had fixed it because no one was supposed to know the tunnel existed. He lifted the latch, turned it. The door opened into the back of a storage room off the royal study's antechamber. They came through into lamplight. Selene set the vault texts on the nearest surface and turned to face him, and her expression was the one she'd been wearing since the staircase landing. Not alarm, not the wide-eyed reaction that fear produces in people unaccustomed to its sudden arrival. The compressed, forward-leaning attention of someone processing fast and not wasting energy on the processing itself. "How many people have keys to the East Wing?" she said. 3. Myself, the head of palace security, and the chamber steward. Aldrich. No, Aldrich has never had access to that wing. Then someone gave him access, or someone is using that corridor who isn't Aldrich. Someone reported to him, which means someone in this palace with key access has been in contact with him. Vaeric moved to the study door and checked the corridor beyond through the gap. Empty, lamplit, the quiet of a palace at the midpoint of a night that most of it had spent trying to understand. Which means the head of palace security or the chamber steward. Or both. He did not answer because both was a possibility he was running the arithmetic on and did not want to speak aloud until the numbers resolved. The head of palace security was a man named Corvath, who had served 3 kings before Vaeric and whose competence was so thoroughly established that questioning his loyalty had never seemed like a productive use of suspicion. The chamber steward was younger, appointed 4 years ago, unremarkable in every sense that made a person easy to overlook. Vaeric thought about easy to overlook. He thought about 20 years of governing and how many things he had not questioned because they presented themselves as settled. Aldrich had been settled. The interpretation of the ancient texts had been settled. The necessity of the ritual had been settled. There was a particular quality to the recognition that you have been managed, not deceived in the obvious way, not lied to with clumsy fabrications that should have been caught, but managed, steered. The information in your path arranged so that the conclusions you reached felt like your own conclusions, built from your own judgment, applied to the available evidence, and the available evidence had been curated by someone who understood your judgment well enough to know which evidence would produce which conclusions. 20 years. Aldrich had been in the room for 20 years of decisions. The mate bond pressed hard in Vaeric's chest, not the pulling ache of the ritual's worst moments, but the solid, grounding pressure of something that had settled into permanence. He was aware of Selene 4 feet behind him, aware of the warmth of her presence the way you are aware of a fire in a cold room, not just with temperature, but with something more fundamental, the body's acknowledgement of a heat source that it intends to orient toward. He filed it. There was no operational use for it in the next 60 seconds, and approximately 40 operational problems that required attention before dawn. "I need to know who was in that corridor," he said, "without alerting them that we know they were there. You need someone Aldrich's network hasn't reached. I need someone whose loyalty I can verify independently. In the next 10 minutes. Yes." Selene was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Alpha clans. Not your army command. The clan heads directly. How many of the major clans came to the capital for the eclipse? 4 sent representatives. Were they in the gallery tonight? 2 of them. The Ashvale clan head and the Dremora second. The clans have no connection to the Seer Order? Historically antagonistic to it, Vaeric said. The Seers have been pushing for centralized governance for 2 generations. The clan heads have been resisting it for 2 generations. Then they are the only people in this palace tonight whose alignment with Aldrich is structurally impossible. She moved to his side. Get them here. Now. Not a formal summons. A personal one. Your own voice. No intermediary. He looked at her. The decision was already made. He could feel it in the way his body had already turned toward the corridor before his mind had finished the sentence. She was right. The arithmetic was simple. Simple arithmetic had never been his problem with her. The problem had been simpler and harder than arithmetic. He pushed the door open and went. The Ashvale clan head was a woman named Bretta, who slept in full traveling clothes on principle because principle, she had explained to Vaeric once, was the only thing that held when everything practical had failed. She answered his knock in 4 seconds, and was dressed and armed in 8, and did not ask any questions in the corridor because she read his face and understood that the corridor was not the place. The Drumora second was a man named Kaev, who was not sleeping at all. He was sitting at the window of his guest chamber watching the silver light still moving faintly in the northern quarter of the city where the first temple stood, and when Vaeric appeared in his doorway, Kaev simply stood and followed. They assembled in the royal study. 4 people in a lamplit room in the hours before dawn, with the palace's east wing sealed and compromised above them, and 11 waking temples scattered across a kingdom that had spent 6 hours absorbing the most significant event in its recorded history. Bretta looked at Selene, looked at the texts on the table, looked at the faint shimmer of silver that was still, very quietly, present at the edges of Selene's eyes when the lamplight caught them correctly. The seer's translation was false, Bretta said. It was not a question. Selectively false, Selene said. The outcome described was accurate. The mechanism was not. The vessel doesn't die. No, Bretta looked at Vaeric. The seers told you she would die. They told me the ritual required a sacred mate sacrifice, Vaeric said. Death was the implied mechanism. The full text uses the word activation. Kaev had been standing with his arms crossed since he entered. Now he unfolded them. Where is Aldrich? That's what we need you to find out, Vaeric said. He left through the western gate 2 hours ago. Destination listed as the border archives. The listing is false. You want us to track him. I want you to find him without using anyone in my guard command, my council, or my palace staff. Kaev absorbed this. You don't know how far the compromise goes, he said. I know it reaches the east wing key access. Beyond that, I don't know. Bretta and Kaev exchanged a look. The compressed communication of 2 people who had spent enough time in political proximity to speak in the economy of shared context. Give us 2 hours, Bretta said. You have one. She nodded once and was at the door. Kaev followed. The room contracted to Vaeric and Selene, and the sound of the study's oil lamp, and the distant, very faint sound from the northern quarter that might have been the first temple or might have been the city's infrastructure responding to a night that had stressed it beyond ordinary parameters. Selene opened the first of the texts. You're going to read, Vaeric said. Someone should. She did not look up. Sit down if you're going to pace. Pacing wastes time. I'm not pacing. You took 3 steps left, stopped, took 2 steps right, and stopped again. That's pacing. He sat. The next 50 minutes were the strangest of Vaeric's life, which was a field with considerable competition. He sat at one end of the royal study table while the woman he had put in chains 6 hours ago read ancient texts under lamplight and occasionally said without looking up, things like the Darkness Army is described as having a command structure, which means it can be negotiated with or manipulated, which means it's not extinction level if approached correctly, and the temples were built as communication relays, not just ritual sites. There's a network implication here that means each woken temple can transmit information to the others, and the presence of a 12th temple under the Seer headquarters is not an accident, and someone knew about it for a very long time. Vaeric listened to each of these. He processed them in the operational register where they became tactical variables. He was also aware, with the peripheral attention of someone who has learned to track multiple things simultaneously, that she had not slept, had not eaten, had been through the physical and presumably metaphysical shock of a divine awakening several hours ago, and was sitting straight and reading with complete focus, and had not once displayed any of the symptoms that those circumstances should have produced. She was built differently than he had understood. He had underestimated her, he realized, in the specific way that people underestimate those they have not given sufficient attention to, not maliciously, not from contempt, from the assumption, the lazy, dangerous assumption, that absence of evidence about a person's depth is evidence of absence. He was revising the assumption. The revision was arriving at an uncomfortable speed and with an uncomfortable level of retroactive illumination about the 3 months he had spent governing carefully around the mate bond's demands while the person those demands were directed toward sat across various formal dinners and waited to see if he would look at her like she was worth looking at. The door opened. Bretta. 53 minutes. Her traveling clothes were damp at the shoulders from the night air, and her jaw was set in the way that jaws set when the information they are about to deliver is worse than expected. "He's in the city," she said. Vaeric went still. Not the border archives. Not outside the gates. He went through the western gate and came back through the drainage access on the riverside. She looked at Vaeric steadily. "He's in the Voss estate." The silence in the study had a specific weight after that. Vaeric felt it settle onto his shoulders like armor, the particular heaviness of a shape he had already half known but had been running calculations around rather than through. Voss. The gallery, front row. The expression that Selene had described as someone whose timing had changed. Not surprise. Recalibration. "How long has Aldrich been at the Voss estate?" Vaeric said. "Kayev's contact says there's been regular traffic between the seer quarters and the Voss estate for the past 4 months. Night hours, small groups, never enough to flag the standard watch patterns." 4 months. 4 months before the ritual. 4 months of Aldrich translating the ancient text, bringing them to Vaeric's desk, delivering the recommendation for the mate sacrifice with the gravity of a man reluctantly doing his duty. 4 months of Voss gathering the minor houses. The timing was not coincidental. The timing was a plan. Vaeric stood. The operational register was fully engaged now, and there was nothing underneath it that was not also operational. The anger had converted cleanly, the way high-quality fuel converts, into direction and momentum and the absolute clarity of a man who has identified his target. "The council convenes in 3 hours," he said. "Voss will be there. He'll have spent the night constructing the narrative. King sacrifices divine mate. Kingdom suffers divine retribution. King must be replaced to restore order. He'll have the minor houses aligned before the session opens." "He'll also have Aldrich," Selene said. She had closed the text. She was looking at Vaeric with the same quality of attention she had been using on the ancient pages. Focused, thorough, deciding what was accurate. "A head seer who can testify that the ritual was conducted as prescribed," she said. "That everything that happened tonight was within the parameters of the ancient texts as he understood them. That the king acted on the best available knowledge in a crisis that threatened the entire kingdom." "Making me incompetent rather than criminal," Vaeric said. "Making you manageable," she corrected. "A criminal king can be removed on charges. An incompetent king who acted in good faith can be managed, guided, advised, increasingly constrained by a council that gradually absorbs decision-making authority. Voss doesn't want the throne empty. He wants the throne occupied by someone he can steer." The same word he had used in his own head 12 minutes ago. Steer. "While you," Selene continued, "present a problem for that plan. An awakened divine vessel who has read the full texts and knows the seer's translation was selective is a witness he cannot manage. Which means, you're the first problem he moves to neutralize," Vaeric said. "I'm the only problem he needs to neutralize. Remove me from the equation and the rest reconstructs cleanly around whatever story Aldrich tells." Bretta was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone determining where her clan's interests intersected with the situation's geometry. "What do you need from us?" she said to Vaeric. "Everything changes in the next 3 hours," Vaeric said. "The council session is the moment Voss has been building toward. If I walk into that session without being able to counter his narrative with evidence, he controls the room. The texts are evidence, Selene said. Texts require translation, and the only translators with the old script are Aldrich's people. No, she said. They're not. Not anymore. She put her palm flat on the cover of the first volume. I can read them, she said. In open session, every word. In the old script and the current language, simultaneously, in front of every member of the council and every noble Voss has assembled and whatever foreign witnesses are still in the city. Vaeric looked at her. A divine vessel reading ancient texts in their original language is evidence that cannot be dismissed, she said. It also cannot be accused of selective translation. It is what it is, in front of everyone, with no intermediary. Voss will say you're performing it, that the markings can be faked, that the reading is rehearsed. Let him say it. Her eyes held the faint silver that had been present since the eclipse. Let him say it in the same room where the clan heads felt every wolf in the kingdom go down at the eclipse peak. Let him say it to the foreign emissaries who watched the chamber floor light up from the gallery. Let him explain specifically what performance technique produces marks in the old script on a woman's skin in real time. The logic was clean. Vaeric recognized clean logic the way he recognized clean blade work, by the absence of waste. There's still the question of the 12th temple, Bretta said. Both Vaeric and Selene turned to her. If Aldrich's headquarters sat above a buried temple for 20 years, Bretta said, and Aldrich has been in contact with Voss for 4 months, and Voss's estate is in the eastern quarter. She stopped. Let the geography speak. Vaeric moved to the study's wall map. The capital laid out in its quadrants, the palace district, the noble estates, the seer headquarters in the northern quarter adjacent to the old temple ruins, Voss's estate in the eastern quarter, 3 streets from the river wall. He put his finger on the seer headquarters. Drew a line south. Drew a line east. The junction of the 2 lines landed in the eastern quarter, on the Voss estate. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room in which everyone has simultaneously understood something that changes the size of the problem. The 12th temple isn't just under the seer headquarters, Selene said quietly. She came to stand beside him at the map. The 12th temple is a network node, she said. The texts describe a relay structure. The temples communicate through underground channels. The one under the seer headquarters is the relay point, which means the channel runs somewhere. She looked at the map, looked at the line. And if someone has been sitting on top of that channel for 20 years, they've had access to whatever the channel carries, Vaeric said. Not just access. Her voice was very level. The channel carries the temple's signal, the divine network. If someone has been intercepting that signal for 20 years, they've been monitoring every activation, every communication, every shift in the divine infrastructure of this kingdom. She paused. They knew the temples were approaching reactivation. They knew a vessel was close to awakening. They had 20 years of warning. Bretta said very carefully, the famine, the soulless wolves, the black rivers. The dormancy symptoms, Selene confirmed. Could those have been manufactured? The room held its breath. Selene looked at the text. She turned to the page she had been reading when Vaeric went to wake the clan representatives. Read for 30 seconds, turned the page, read again. She closed the book. Yes, she said. The word was very quiet. Not fully manufactured. The darkness is real. The army in the north, the approach, that's documented across multiple independent sources in these texts, and it predates any human interference by centuries. But the dormancy symptoms in this specific kingdom at this specific time. She stopped. They can be induced. If you have access to the relay channel, if you know how the divine network's signal translates into physical effects in a territory it covers. Vaeric stood with his hand on the wall map and felt the shape of 20 years rearrange itself in the space behind his eyes. Famines. He had fought 5 of them, had redistributed resources, had opened the grain reserves, had made the brutal calculations about which regions to prioritize when there was not enough for all regions, had blamed border conflicts, had blamed weather patterns, had implemented agricultural reforms. The wolves born without souls. He had put 3 shamans to death for it, believing it a curse, had spent 2 years searching for the source of the corruption, the rivers, the water management teams. The engineers brought from the eastern territories, the expense of it, the time, the political capital spent managing the noble houses who lost crops to the contamination. All of it. All of it had been leverage. Not random catastrophe, not the kingdom's misfortune, not the cumulative cost of 20 years of border wars. A pressure system, designed to produce in a king of Vaeric's specific temperament, practical, empire-focused, willing to make the unsentimental calculation. Exactly the conditions that would make a mate sacrifice seem like the least worst option. He had been run, like a problem to be solved, like a mechanism to be engaged. He had been the most powerful man in 6 territories, and he had been run by a man in dark robes who sat 3 chairs to his left at every council session and looked at the table when he spoke and delivered bad news with the careful gravity of the devoted and reluctant servant. Vaeric's hand pressed flat against the map, against the eastern quarter, against the estate of a man who had spent 4 months gathering minor houses and was currently sleeping inside a plan that he believed was proceeding correctly. The anger that moved through him was not the operational variety. It was older and more physical, the kind that lives in the chest rather than the head, that produces a specific stillness in the hands and a specific quality of clarity in the eyes that people who had faced Vaeric Draven across battlefields described afterward, if they survived to describe anything, as the moment you understood why wolves called him iron. The council session, he said. His voice was level, entirely level. The levelness was its own temperature. The council session happens in 3 hours, he said. I want Voss in that room. I want Aldrich in that room. I want every minor house Voss has spent 4 months gathering, and I want the foreign emissaries, and I want the Alpha Clan heads, and I want every member of the gallery who watched tonight. Bretta was watching his face carefully. And what happens in that room? They get 1 chance, Vaeric said. 1. To explain what has been done to this kingdom across 20 years, and who made the decisions, and what they intended, in front of every witness in the city. He looked at Bretta. After that, I stopped giving chances. Bretta nodded once. She left. The study was quiet again. Selene was looking at him. Not the assessment look. The other one. The one he had almost no data on because she had deployed it rarely in 3 months of minimal interaction. Something more direct than assessment. Something that looked at him and was making a decision that was not strategic. You already knew part of it, she said. The coalition Voss was building. You said you were watching. I was watching, he said. I didn't know what it was attached to. You suspected Aldrich. He looked at her. Not Aldrich specifically, he said. I suspected something in the Seer Order's institutional interests had shaped the ritual recommendation. I didn't know the scope. I didn't know the 20 years. A pause. If I'd known the 20 years, I would not have chained you to the altar. But you might have done something else that also required my consent and didn't ask for it, she said. The sentence sat between them without aggression, but without softness either. A clean incision, not designed to wound, but not designed to spare. Probably, he said. She held his gaze. That's honest, at least. I'm trying, he said, to be honest with you. I understand it's late in the sequence for that to carry weight. It carries some, she said. Not enough to erase what it's following, but some. The mate bond between them was doing something he did not attempt to name. He had run out of the vocabulary he'd been using to manage it, and the new vocabulary had not yet arrived, and in the space between the old and the new, he simply stood with it and did not pretend it was not there. The eastern sky through the study window was beginning, barely, to gray at its lowest edge. The council session was 2 hours and 40 minutes away. What happened next happened in 2 stages, and the first stage was almost too quiet for what it was. Kaev came through the door at a pace that was not running, but was the compressed, deliberate version that experienced soldiers use when running would cost them the controlled entrance, and the controlled entrance matters. My king, he said, something in his voice. Vaeric turned. Kaev looked at Selene, back at Vaeric. The Crimson Fang Legion crossed the eastern border an hour ago. Vaeric absorbed this. How many? 20,000 by the Outriders' count. Moving at campaign pace, not invasion pace. They're not trying to hold territory. They're moving directly toward the capital. Directly. Northeast line, straight toward the city. Vaeric looked at Selene, the eastern border. The Crimson Fang, which had been raiding the border regions for 2 years in patterns consistent with testing defensive response times rather than actual territorial ambition. 2 years of pressure that had required him to commit troops and resources and attention to the eastern defense. 2 years of being occupied at the eastern edge, while the center arranged itself. How did a 20,000 force cross the border without 6 hours of warning? He said. Kiev was quiet for a moment. The Eastern Garrison commander sent the alert an hour after the crossing. The alert was routed through the signal network. The signal network that runs through the Palace Communications Center. Yes. Where the East Wing key access connects to the communications infrastructure. Kiev did not answer. He did not need to. The communications had been held. The alert had been in the system for an hour before it moved, and it had been held by someone with access to the communications routing and the East Wing connected to the communications routing, and the East Wing had been accessed tonight by someone with a key that was not supposed to exist. The invasion was not opportunistic. The invasion had been timed. The ritual last night, the awakening, the chaos of a kingdom absorbing the most significant event in its history, the cover under which a 20,000 force could cross a border and spend an hour en route before the king knew they were coming. An hour at campaign pace toward the capital. 3 hours until the council session where Voss intended to manage the political transition. And somewhere in the East Wing, someone with a key was almost certainly still at the communications routing. Vaeric looked at the window. The gray edge of pre-dawn had reached the level of the second-floor roof lines now. He made 3 decisions in the space of 4 seconds, the way he made decisions when the arithmetic compressed into emergency, not sequentially, not with deliberation, but in the simultaneous convergence of 20 years of pattern recognition applied to a situation moving faster than deliberation could track. The army mobilized. The council session moved to immediate emergency convening. And Selene would stand in that chamber not in 3 hours, but now, in the gray pre-dawn, before Voss had finished sleeping, before Aldrich had finished his conversation in the Voss estate, before anyone who was expecting the morning to unfold at their timeline had a chance to complete their arrangement. "Can you do it now?" he said to Selene. She knew what he was asking. She looked at the texts. She looked at the window and the pre-dawn gray and the silver that was still, quietly, present at the edge of her vision. She thought about what she carried in the awakened memory. Every war, every governance decision, every wolf clan that knelt, and every one that burned. The weight of it. Not a burden exactly, but a presence. A reference library of what power had looked like in its worst configurations and what had survived them and what had not. She thought about the man standing across the study table who had put her in chains and whose face, when the chains broke, had shown her, for exactly 1 fraction of a second, what the control was costing him. She thought about what it meant to choose a direction when all the directions were wrong to varying degrees, and the only question was which wrongness was survivable. "Yes," she said. She picked up the 3 texts. She moved to the door. And in the eastern quarter of the capital, in the Voss estate where a head seer and a general and a plan that had been 20 years in construction were entering their final hours, something woke that should not have. Not a wolf, not a person. The channel beneath the estate, the relay point of the temple network, the divine infrastructure that someone had been sitting on for 2 decades, pulsed. Once, with silver light that came up through the Voss estate's foundation stones and was visible for exactly 2 seconds through the gaps in the estate's old flooring before it went dark again. The signal had recognized its origin. The network was complete. And in a room in the Voss estate where 2 men had been planning the morning's events, with the confidence of a long-running plan entering its final phase, Aldrich looked at the floor and then looked at Voss and said, very quietly, the 4 words that collapsed 4 months of construction into something that required immediate and desperate revision. She read the texts. Voss was still. "All of them," Aldrich said. The silence in the Voss estate was a different quality of silence than the silence in the royal study. Not the silence of people thinking toward a solution, but the silence of people understanding that the ground they had been standing on was no longer there. Voss stood. moved to the window, looked at the eastern sky beginning its gray pre-dawn. He had spent 4 months building a coalition, 20 years watching and waiting and positioning. He had built it on the certainty that the awakening, if it could not be prevented, could at least be managed. A confused vessel, isolated, without context, controllable through the king, whose grief and guilt would make him pliant. A seer order with exclusive interpretive authority over the ancient record. A 20,000 force at the border, ready to provide the external pressure that would make any internal political transition feel like necessity rather than coup. He had built it on a foundation that required Selene Vaelor to be something that she was not. He turned from the window. "Then we don't wait for the council session," he said. Aldrich looked at him. "We move now," Voss said, "before she does." He crossed to the estate's interior door, opened it. On the other side, 40 men in the armor of the palace's eastern garrison. Not Crimson Fang, not foreign soldiers, but the king's own guard, men who had been walking the palace corridors for years, stood in 2 columns with drawn weapons, men whose loyalty had been built carefully, over time, with the same patience and the same curation of information that had built everything else. "Bring me the king," Voss said. He paused. "And bring me her alive," he said, "whatever you have to do." The 40 men came through the palace's north entrance at the hour before dawn, when the guard rotation was thinnest and the corridors between the eastern garrison barracks and the royal wing required crossing only 2 checkpoints, both of which had been managed. Vaeric heard them before he saw them. Not the boots. The boots were disciplined, kept quiet with the specific training of men who had learned to move through stone corridors without announcing themselves. What he heard was the gate mechanism on the north passage, a particular drag in its lower hinge that had been reported for repair twice in the past 6 months and never fixed. A sound so specific and so unremarkable that only someone who had lived inside these walls long enough to memorize their complaints would register it as signal. Vaeric had lived inside these walls for 20 years. He was already moving when Kaev's hand went to his blade. "Study door," Vaeric said. The words were barely breath. "Bar it." Kaev moved. Selene had the text under her arm and was already at the study's secondary panel, not the service tunnel they had used coming up from the vaults, but the older one, the one cut during the first expansion that predated the tunnel by 60 years, and which did not appear on any architectural record held by the palace administration because the original architect had been thorough in his paranoia. Vaeric had found it in his 3rd year. He had told no one. He crossed to it now, pressed the panel release, a specific sequence, 3rd stone from the left, 2nd from the floor, and the section of wall opened inward. "Go," he said to Selene. She looked at him. "Kaev," she said, "behind you. Go." She went. Kaev was through the study door bar and moving before the latch fully engaged. Vaeric was last. He pulled the panel shut from the inside and heard, through 4 inches of stone, the study door taking impact. Not a ram, a coordinated shoulder strike, 3 men or more, the particular sound of organized force applied to interior wood. The panel held. They moved. The old passage ran parallel to the royal wing's main corridor for 40 feet before cutting east toward the palace's interior courtyard system. No lamps. Vaeric moved from memory in the complete dark, one hand on the wall, feet finding the floor's irregularities the way feet find them when they have made the same path enough times that the body no longer requires eyes to complete it. Selene was silent ahead of him. No stumbling, no reaching for the wall. Moving with the same quality of spatial certainty she had shown in the vault tunnel, as if the darkness in these old passages was not an obstacle, but simply an environment. He filed that. Later. Kaev's breathing behind him was controlled, the measured cadence of trained combat preparation, slowing the heart rate before it was needed, banking the calm for the moment the calm would be spent. 20 feet, 30. The passage terminated at a stone drop into the courtyard's utility level, a 6-foot descent to a flagged floor used for supply access. Vaeric went first, dropped, steadied, reached up. Selene came down without needing the steadying. Kaev landed behind her. The courtyard utility level was gray pre-dawn and open to the sky above the supply storage rooflines. The eastern horizon showed the first actual color, a narrow band of dark amber at the city's edge, the sun 40 minutes from clearing the walls. 40 minutes. The council chamber was in the palace's south wing. The south wing was accessible through the courtyard system without crossing the north passage where Voss's men had entered. That route was still open. But 20,000 Crimson Fang soldiers were an hour out of the capital at campaign pace and had been moving for 90 minutes now, which put them 30 minutes from the outer wall. Vaeric did the arithmetic. Council chamber in 12 minutes. Outer wall in 30. The arithmetic left 18 minutes in which the council session could occur before the city was inside a siege perimeter, and the political question of who governed the kingdom became secondary to the military question of whether the kingdom survived the morning. 18 minutes was enough if he moved now and did not stop for any of the things that were pulling at him. The study where Voss's men were currently breaking through a barred door. The east wing where the communications compromise was still active. The Voss estate where a 20-year plan had just shifted to emergency execution. He moved. Selene moved beside him without being asked. Kiev fell into the trailing position that combat-experienced soldiers take automatically when the person they are covering is someone the enemy has specifically requested alive. They crossed the courtyard in the pre-dawn at a pace just below running. The South Wing guards at the council chamber entrance were 2 men from the Ashvale escort. Bretta had placed them there 40 minutes ago, which meant they were clan loyal rather than palace staff, which meant they had not been in Voss's network, which meant when Vaeric came through the courtyard gate with Tex carrying Selene and a drawn blade Dremora second, they simply moved aside and opened the door. The council chamber smelled of cold air and old wood and the lamp oil from the permanent fixtures that burned regardless of whether a session was in progress, a practical concession to the frequency with which emergencies did not wait for daylight. Vaeric went straight to the speaking dais. "Get the council members," he said to the nearest Ashvale guard. "All of them. Now. Whatever they're doing." The guard left at a run. Vaeric looked at Selene. "How long to translate the relevant passages aloud?" She set the texts on the dais table and opened the first volume to the page she had marked. "The activation mechanism and the false translation. 10 minutes if I move through it. The relay network and the manufactured dormancy. Another 8. You have 15 total." She looked at him. "The Crimson Fang hits the outer wall in 30 minutes, he said. "When they do, every decision in this chamber becomes a war decision rather than a governance decision. And war decisions are made by the military command, which is currently Voss's alignment." She understood. He watched the understanding arrive in her face and settle into the expression he recognized as her operational register, the forward-leaning compression that processed without performing. 15 minutes, she said. The council members arrived in stages over the next 6 minutes, some dressed, some not fully. The Alpha Clan heads came with them, Bretta's Ashvale guard presence ensuring that the message had reached clan ears before palace ears. The foreign emissaries appeared, which surprised Vaeric, until he realized that Bretta had been thorough. 40 people in the council chamber at pre-dawn. Vaeric stood at the dais and looked at them, and the part of him that had governed for 20 years read the room in 3 seconds. The confusion of the woken suddenly, the alertness of those who had already been awake and thinking, and in 3 faces, the specific quality of alertness that was not confusion at all, but rather the alertness of people who had expected a different opening scene for this morning and were recalibrating. 3 faces. 2 junior council members and the foreign emissary from the Northern Trade Delegation. He filed them. "The ritual performed last night in the Moon Temple," Vaeric said. His voice carried across the chamber without projection. The room's acoustics were built for it. "Was based on a translation of ancient texts provided by the Seer Order. The council was briefed on that translation. I am going to tell you that the translation was deliberately falsified, and then you are going to hear the accurate translation from the only living person capable of reading the original script." A sound from the assembled. Not chaos, the compressed noise of 40 people absorbing a sentence that restructures their understanding of the previous 12 hours. "After that," Vaeric said, "I'm going to tell you that the Crimson Fang Legion crossed the eastern border 90 minutes ago and is currently 30 minutes from this city's outer wall. And then we are going to make the decisions that need to be made before they arrive." He stepped back from the dais. Selene stepped forward. The chamber watched her with the quality of attention that significant physical events produce. The residue of last night still present, the eclipse, the light through the temple walls, the collapse of every wolf in the kingdom and their subsequent return. The silver at the edges of her eyes, faint in the lamplight but visible to those close enough to see clearly. She opened the first text. She began to read, not performing it, not amplifying it, simply reading, in the ancient script and then in the current language, with the directness of someone translating at genuine speed rather than staging a demonstration. The passages moved through the chamber and landed differently in different ears. The clan heads leaned forward, the foreign emissaries exchanged rapid, quiet words in their own languages. The council members' faces moved through discomfort and then something harder than discomfort. She reached the relay network section. She reached the manufactured dormancy passage. She stopped. She looked up from the text. "This passage," she said, "describes a method by which the divine relay network can be accessed from a surface structure built above a network node. The access allows, and I am reading directly, the induction of dormancy symptoms in the territory covered by the node. The symptoms listed are agricultural failure, corruption of water sources, disruption of soul bonding in births." The chamber was very quiet. "These are the symptoms this kingdom has experienced across the past 20 years, she said. She closed the text. "The seer headquarters is built above a network node," she said. "The node connects through the relay system to a second access point. That second point is located beneath an estate in the eastern quarter of this capital." She did not say Voss's name. She did not need to. Several people in the room already knew it. The three faces that Vaeric had marked as recalibrating went very still. And then the council chamber's main doors opened. Voss came through them with 16 men. Not 40. 16, which meant that the other 24 had either been delayed by something in the North Passage, or Voss had chosen a smaller, more controlled force for this entrance. The entrance where he would be visible to 40 witnesses, and the decision about how this looked mattered. He was dressed formally. Precisely. The general's formal coat rather than armor, which was a choice that communicated civilian governance rather than military seizure. The costume of a man presenting himself as a servant of order rather than its replacement. He was also wearing the expression of someone who had decided, in the minutes since Aldrich told him she had read the texts, what version of the morning was still recoverable. He looked at the chamber. He looked at Selene at the dais. He looked at Vaeric. "My king," he said. The tone was careful, calibrated. The tone of a man who had not yet abandoned the version where this was managed rather than confronted. "I came as quickly as I could when I heard the emergency convening." Vaeric said nothing. "There have been developments overnight that require urgent counsel." "Where is Aldrich?" Vaeric said. A fractional pause. "I'm not certain. I was told he left the capital." "He left the capital through the western gate and returned through the river drainage and spent the night in your estate." Vaeric's voice was level, entirely level. "I'd like you to explain that to the chamber." Something shifted in Voss's expression. The version where this was managed closed. The version where it was confronted arrived. And in the space between those two versions, in the 2 seconds it took for Voss to cross from one to the other, Vaeric saw what lived underneath the 20 years of careful positioning and patient construction and calibrated presentation. Not ideology, not even ambition in the elevated sense. Simple, structural hunger. The hunger of a man who had been in proximity to power long enough that power's absence had become physically intolerable, the way the body becomes intolerable to itself when denied something it has decided is necessary. Voss had not built 20 years of conspiracy because he believed he would govern better. He had built it because governing was the only thing that made him feel like he was real. "Take the king," Voss said. His 16 men moved. 3 things happened simultaneously. Kaev came off the wall where he had been standing to Vaeric's left with a speed that confirmed what the Drumora were known for. Not size, not force, but the specific efficiency of those who have trained to close distance before the other party has finished the decision to draw. He was between Vaeric and the nearest 2 of Voss's men before the men had fully committed to their direction. Bretta's Ashvale guards at the chamber's south entrance drew, and Selene put her hands flat on the dais table. The silver came up through the table's wood the way it came up through the altar's stone. Not slow, not gradual, but with the complete absence of preamble that power uses when it is not asking permission. Through the table, into the floor, across the chamber's stone in the vein pattern that Vaeric had first seen on the ritual chamber floor. It did not stop at the chamber walls. The sound it made was the same frequency he had felt during the eclipse. Below hearing, above sensation, the thing that moves in the body's foundation rather than through its surface. Every wolf in the chamber felt it. Several stepped backward instinctively. 3 of Voss's 16 men stopped moving entirely, the kind of stop that the body enforces when something in it overrides the command structure. Voss did not stop. He was looking at Selene with an expression Vaeric had not seen him wear before. Not fear, not the species of recalculation that fear produces, but something purer and more honest than any expression he had displayed in the 20 years Vaeric had known him. The expression of a man who has spent 2 decades building leverage against a force he was not certain he believed in, and has just encountered confirmation that the force is real and is looking at him. "Whatever that is," Voss said, voice flat, "it won't stop a sword." He drew. Not at Selene, at Vaeric. The blade was across the chamber in 3 steps. Voss was 60 years old and moved like 50 and trained like 40, a fact that Vaeric had always respected at the level at which he respected dangerous things regardless of their allegiance. Vaeric's own blade came up. The impact of the two in contact was a sound that cut through the silver frequency like something physical cutting light. Metal on metal, the ordinary brutal percussion of 2 men who knew how to use what they were holding. They were close. Too close for full technique, the distance at which fighting becomes something closer to the controlled application of leverage and the uncontrolled application of will. Voss's face was 6 inches from Vaeric's. "You were never going to be enough," Voss said through locked blades. "You fought the right wars, built the right walls, but an empire needs more than a wolf who knows how to hold territory." "This empire," Vaeric said, "has held longer than any of the 6 I took it from. I'll take your concession on the governing ability." He pushed. Voss was strong. He was also 60. The blade break separated them by 4 feet, and Voss recovered into a stance that Vaeric recognized, the defensive pivot that covered the left side exposure, the one Voss used when he was setting up the counter that came off the right. Vaeric had seen it in training yards over 20 years. He had seen it in the reports from every campaign Voss had commanded. He did not wait for the counter. He came in on the left. The exchange was 8 seconds of the specific brutality that happens when 2 experienced fighters are in a space that does not allow for artistry. Short, committed, each movement designed to end rather than to control, because control required distance and distance was not available. Vaeric took the blade across his left forearm, not deep, a scoring cut, the kind that bleeds immediately and hurts cleanly and tells you it's there without disrupting function. He registered it and did not give it more attention than it required. Voss took an elbow across the jaw that rocked him back 2 steps and put his rear foot against the dais platform. The dais was still running silver. Voss's rear foot touched it. What happened to him was not violent. It was the opposite of violent. The absolute cessation of aggression, the body arriving at a full stop not from impact, but from contact with something that the wolf instinct recognized at a level below the rational mind's ability to override it. 20 years of building and planning and managing and positioning, and underneath all of it the body was still a wolf's body, and the wolf's body knew what it was touching. Voss went to one knee, not from defeat, from recognition. He stayed on one knee for exactly 3 seconds, his sword arm dropping to his side, his jaw still red from the elbow, his expression moving through several things in rapid succession. The version where he stood and continued, the version where the calculation reasserted itself, the version where he looked at what was running through the dais and understood that the 20 years had been built on a foundation that was no longer there. He looked up at Vaeric. "The darkness from the north," he said. "You don't understand what it is." Vaeric's sword was leveled at Voss's throat. His forearm was bleeding down the inside of his wrist. "Tell me," he said. "It's not an army," Voss said. "It's not a force you can position against. The ancient records, the complete records, not the pieces the seers have, Describe it as a dissolution, not a conquest, a consumption. It unmakes what it reaches. And your plan for surviving it was what? Vaeric said. Put yourself in control of the kingdom and negotiate with a dissolution event. My plan was to have the relay network, Voss said, not to induce dormancy. That was Aldrich's work, Aldrich's method. My plan was the relay network itself. The 12 nodes, functioning together, form a barrier. A divine infrastructure barrier that the ancient texts say nothing in the physical world can breach. He held Vaeric's gaze. You cannot activate that barrier with 11 temples. You need 12. The 12th is under my estate because I spent 15 years and everything I had finding it, because I read the actual texts, all of them, not the pieces Aldrich released. And I understood what was coming, and I understood what was required. Silence in the chamber. Selene had left the dais. She was standing 2 feet from Voss, looking at him with the silver-edged attention that saw things in registers unavailable to ordinary vision. You're not lying, she said. Voss looked at her. The barrier use, she said. That's in the texts. The full barrier configuration. I read it in the vault. She paused. I didn't understand what it required until now. She looked at Vaeric. The mate bond between them pressed forward with a sudden and specific urgency that was not the warming pressure of the past hour, but something sharper, warning, or premonition, or the body's awareness of a fact that the mind had not yet assembled. The barrier, she said, the full 12-node configuration. Her voice was careful. What does it require to activate? Vaeric said. She was quiet. Selene. The vessel, she said. The divine vessel pours the network's accumulated energy into the barrier seal. All of it. Not a portion. All of it. The chamber had gone entirely still. Defines all of it, Vaeric said. She looked at him. Everything the awakening produced, she said. The divine connection, the memory, the temple network bond. A pause. The vessel goes back to what they were before. Just the divine element. She looked at him for a moment that contained something he could not fully name, but which moved in the mate bond like weather moving through the body of the sea. Yes, she said, just the divine element. He held her gaze. Outside, from the city's northern quarter where the first temple stood, a sound reached them through the council chamber's stone walls. Not the temple's signal, not the silver frequency. A different sound. The war horns of the Crimson Fang Legion. 30 minutes had been 20. The outer wall guards had engaged. The chamber erupted into controlled chaos, council members on their feet, the clan heads moving toward the doors, orders being exchanged in the compressed shorthand of people who had trained for situations like this and were now inside one. Vaeric did not look away from Selene, Voss on the floor beside them, the bleeding in Vaeric's forearm, the sound of the crimson fang horns getting incrementally, undeniably closer. The barrier, he said, if you activate it through the 12 nodes. The dissolution event is sealed out, she said, permanently. The ancient text is specific about permanently. And the crimson fang. The barrier doesn't affect forces already inside it, she said. It seals the dissolution out. The Legion is a physical army. It requires a physical response. He was calculating. He could hear it in his own head. The arithmetic running at the speed it ran when everything was moving and every variable was in motion simultaneously, and the output had to be a decision rather than an analysis. Give me your clan forces, he said to Bretta, who was at his shoulder. Done, she said without hesitation. Kaev. Yes. The royal garrison. The ones whose loyalty we haven't verified. Well, I can separate the compromise from the clean in 10 minutes, Kaev said. I know the roster. Do it. Clean garrison holds the inner wall. Clan forces on me. He looked at Bretta. I need 20 minutes to break the Crimson Fang's advance column before they reach the breach point. What are you doing in 20 minutes? Bretta said. Removing their command structure, he said. If the advance column loses command cohesion, the main force stalls for resupply and orders. 20,000 without a functioning command structure is 20,000 men standing in a field waiting to be tired. Bretta looked at him the way experienced soldiers look at plans that are aggressive to the point of being personal. Then she nodded. Vaeric turned to Voss. Voss was still on one knee on the dais, the sword arm still lowered. The expression that had moved through several things had settled into something that looked, for the first time in 20 years, like a man who had put down a weight he had been carrying so long he had stopped noticing its shape. "The 12th node under your estate," Vaeric said. "Can it be accessed without you?" A long pause. "No," Voss said. "The access mechanism requires the sequence I developed. It's not in any text." "Then you're going to provide it." "In exchange for what?" Vaeric looked at him steadily. "In exchange for the fact that when this is over and the barrier is sealed and the dissolution is out, you stand in front of the council and tell them every decision you made and who you made it with, and what it cost this kingdom across 20 years. All of it. In front of witnesses. On record." Voss looked at the floor. "And then what?" he said. "And then the kingdom decides," Vaeric said. "Not me, the council, the clan heads, the surviving noble houses. All of it in the open, whatever they determine." Voss was quiet for several seconds. "Aldrich," he said. "Same terms. If he's willing." Another long pause. Then Voss stood. He stood with the deliberate effort of a man who is old and has been on the floor and is not going to pretend that standing is effortless when it is not. Honest in a way that was different from everything else Vaeric had observed in 20 years of watching him perform competence and control. "The access sequence," Voss said, "requires entering the estate's lower level through the foundation room and speaking a specific command in the old script." He looked at Selene. "Which she can read," he said. "Which I cannot." Selene looked at Vaeric. The war horn sounded again, closer, the advance column no more than 15 minutes from the north gate now. The arithmetic, 15 minutes for the advance column to reach the gate. 20 minutes needed to break their command structure. The barrier activation requiring Selene at the Voss estate's 12th node, which was in the eastern quarter, opposite direction from the north gate. Two things. Opposite directions. One person who needed to be in both. Vaeric looked at the forearm where Voss's blade had scored him, still bleeding, the sleeve dark. He looked at the council chamber around him, the people in it, the 40-odd witnesses to a morning that was not finished breaking yet. He looked at Selene. He had put her in chains. He had stood at a gallery railing and told himself that kings were not built to love, and the empire came first, and the mate bond was a variable to be managed. And he had watched the blade touch her palm, and had felt the bond tearing in his chest, and had held the king's face anyway, had maintained the control anyway, had been certain, was still, in some part of him, built to be certain, that the calculus he was running was the right one. He had been wrong about the calculus before. He was aware, standing in a council chamber with a bleeding arm and war horns in the distance, and the mate bond pressing with that sharp-edged urgency that felt like warning, that there was a version of the next 20 minutes in which the calculus required him to do something that would cost him more than his arm. He just did not yet know which version was coming. "The Voss estate," he said to Selene, "can you reach it and complete the activation before the dissolution front advances further?" "The dissolution front isn't the immediate problem," she said. "The Crimson Fang is." "The Crimson Fang is my problem," he said. "And after?" "After you activate the barrier." She held his gaze with those silver-edged eyes that had looked at him from an altar and refused to close and refused to beg and told him to carry the weight of what he had done there, and he had been carrying it, and he would carry it past this morning and into whatever came after, and it would not become lighter with distance. "After," she said. She picked up the texts. She looked at Voss. "Take me to the estate." And Vaeric turned toward the north. Outside, the first Crimson Fang soldiers were testing the gate. He could hear it. The specific impact pattern of a ram against wood, the shouted cadence of the assault teams, the return fire of the wall guards. 20 minutes. He needed 20 minutes, and he had perhaps 17. He crossed the chamber floor at a pace that was not running and was not walking, and covered the distance in 6 seconds, and pushed through the main door into the corridor where Kiev was waiting with 14 clan soldiers, and the clean garrison Kiev had separated in 8 minutes because Kiev had said 10 and had been accounting for margin. The corridor was gray morning light coming through the slit windows. The war horns rose again, louder now. Vaeric felt the mate bond at the maximum sensitivity of his awareness. Felt Selene moving through the palace behind him in the other direction. felt the distance beginning to open between them the way you feel a wound opening, and registered it as information and moved through it without stopping because there was no version of the next 20 minutes in which stopping was available. He had spent 20 years learning what he was willing to lose. He was learning something new about that today. The north corridor ended at the gate room, and the gate room's iron door was shaking under the ram's impact, and the guards on the wall above were pouring everything they had on the advance column, and Vaeric came through the inner courtyard at the head of 14 clan soldiers and a garrison element, and the armor he was wearing was not the ceremonial black of last night, but the plain campaign steel he had put on when Kaev brought the Crimson Fang report. 14 soldiers. He knew what 14 soldiers were against a 20,000 force advance column. He also knew what a king appearing personally at the front of a gate breach did to the psychology of an attacking force that had been told the king was contained. He had used that before. He had used a lot of things before that had their current application and their long-term cost. And the difference between the king he had been for 20 years and whatever he was becoming was not in the willingness to use them, but in the growing awareness that the cost accounting had to be honest, that you could not build an empire on calculations that ignored what the calculations cost. The gate shuddered. The iron bar was holding. The ram hit it again. Vaeric put his hand on the gate bar and looked at Kaev and the 14 soldiers behind him. "When this opens," he said, "we go straight through the column, not the edge, the center. We take the command element and we do not stop for anything that is not the command element." 14 people. Every one of them looked at him with the expression that experienced soldiers get when the plan is aggressive to the point of being a philosophical position about mortality. Not reckless, not afraid, but the specific clarity of those who have decided that the person beside them is worth whatever today costs. He had built that, not with fear, with 20 years of going through the center instead of the edge, of being found exactly where he said he would be, of being the kind of king that people followed into things that were too dangerous for following. The gate hit a third time. The iron bar cracked. One more. Vaeric's hand tightened on the bar from the inside, not to hold it, but for the second before he released it, in the very last breath before the fourth impact, and the gate blowing inward, and everything that followed becoming physical rather than calculated. He thought of Selene, not as a strategy, not as a variable, as a fact. The way the body thinks about the thing it has decided is necessary, without argument, without justification, simply as the organizing truth around which everything else arranges itself. He thought of her at the altar, refusing to close her eyes. He thought of her reading the ancient texts at 3 a.m. with the exhaustion of a divine awakening and the cool, deliberate focus of someone who was not going to be disoriented by what had happened to her because disorientation was not available in the current timeline. He thought of the silver at the edges of her eyes, and what she had told him it would cost her to seal the barrier, and the way she had looked at him when she said after. The gate took the fourth hit. The bar gave. The gate blew inward. And Vaeric Draven went through it at the front of 14 soldiers into the advance column of a 20,000 force legion, while 2 miles east, in the foundation room of the Voss estate, the woman who wore the moon opened a text in the oldest script the kingdom had ever spoken and began to read the words that would seal the darkness out forever. And the dissolution front, moving from the north with the patient absolute certainty of something that did not hurry because it did not need to, reached the kingdom's outer border. And the 12th node, waking, sent its signal through the relay network, and the 11 temples across the kingdom answered. And in the courtyard of the north gate where the blade work was already brutal, and the advance column had not yet understood that the figure at the center of the resistance was the king himself, Vaeric felt the relay network activate through the mate bond like a struck bell felt through stone. Felt it, and understood what it meant, and kept moving, because understanding and stopping were two different things, and he had never been built to stop. The question, the only question that mattered in the space between the gate and the barrier's completion, and whatever Selene was reading at the 12th node, was whether after was still available, whether the version where she walked out of the Voss estate and he walked away from the north gate, and the two of them occupied the same space on the other side of this morning, was the version that arrived. Vaeric drove through the column's center, and the morning broke open around him. And somewhere in the eastern quarter, Selene's voice in the old script rose through the foundations of a buried temple. and the darkness, crossing the northern border, felt the network light and changed its direction. Toward the source. Toward her. 3/3. The dissolution front hit the Voss estate's outer wall. At the same moment, Selene reached the third passage of the activation sequence. She felt it before she heard it. A pressure drop so complete that the air in the foundation room changed quality, became something thicker and colder and more deliberate, as if the atmosphere itself was being renegotiated by a presence that had not been asked its opinion and did not intend to ask for one in return. The oil lamp in the corner of the foundation room went out. Not flickered, simply stopped, the way the torches in the ritual chamber had stopped the night before, with the complete indifference of a flame that has encountered something that does not require its light because it carries its own dark. Selene kept reading. The old script moved through her throat with a fluency that was not hers, or rather, was hers in the way that everything the awakening had returned to her was hers, held in a memory that predated this body and this name and this particular configuration of a woman standing in a buried foundation room with 3 ancient texts and a general's estate collapsing around the edges of her awareness. Voss was at the room's entrance behind her. He had been silent since they descended, the silence of a man who had made his accounting and was waiting to see what it produced, not with hope exactly, but with the particular quality of attention that people give the final stage of something they have carried too long. The dissolution hit the outer wall a second time. The stone cracked. Not the clean crack of impact or structural failure, so the dissolution didn't work through force. It worked through subtraction. The mortar between the stones lost its cohesion, not because it was broken, but because the principle of cohesion was being removed from it, the way frost removes itself from glass when the temperature changes, leaving the surface not destroyed but simply no longer held together by the property that had organized it. The outer wall of the Voss estate began to separate, stone by stone, quietly, falling away from each other with the gentle inevitability of things that have forgotten why they were assembled. Selene read faster. The activation sequence in the ancient text was 42 lines. She was on line 29. The network had already answered. She could feel all 12 nodes pulsing in the relay architecture, the way you feel a current through water, distributed and simultaneous, and building toward the configuration that the text described as the barrier state, the sealed perimeter that nothing from outside the network's coverage could cross. But the barrier required completion. All 42 lines, line 30. The dissolution touched the estate's inner courtyard wall. Selene heard Voss make a sound behind her. Not a word, just the involuntary compression of breath that a person makes when they see something their mind cannot immediately categorize as real. She did not look. Looking required attention, and attention was finite, and every unit of it was in the text. Line 33. The foundation room's floor began to do what the outer wall had done. Not crack, not shake, but separate at its joints with the patient dissolution of something that had decided the principle holding it together was no longer applicable. A gap opened along the eastern seam, 2 inches wide, 3, and through it came not light and not air, but the particular quality of absence that the dissolution carried the way a fire carries heat, as its nature, not as a byproduct. Selene felt it touch the edge of the divine network she was channeling, and the network pushed back, not aggressively, not with the violence of a force meeting a force, with the specific resistance of a principle meeting its counterprinciple, 2 fundamental properties of the world pressing against each other at their boundary, each complete in itself and incompatible with the other's presence. The dissolution slowed, not stopped, slowed. The gap in the floor stopped widening. The outer wall's separation paused mid-stone. The air quality in the foundation room held its changed state, but did not progress further. The network was holding the dissolution at its current position, but it could not hold indefinitely at partial activation. 11 nodes against the dissolution's full presence was a temporary equilibrium, not a solution. The text had been specific about this. 11 nodes created resistance. 12 nodes, fully activated through the vessel's complete channeling, created the barrier, permanent, absolute, sealed. The difference between 11 and 12 was everything. Selene was on line 37. Her voice in the old script had a quality now that it had not had at the beginning of the sequence. Not louder, but denser, each syllable carrying more of the network's accumulated energy as the activation built toward its completion, the way a wave builds as it approaches a shore, gathering what is behind it into what is ahead. She was aware of what line 42 meant. The text had not been ambiguous, and she had not been ambiguous with Vaeric when she told him what the full activation required. The divine element, the connection to the network, the memory of 1,000 years of governance and war, and the faces of kings who had knelt, and the sound of civilizations that had not survived the choices their rulers made. All of it, poured into the barrier, sealed there, permanent. She would walk out of this foundation room as Selene Vaelor, a merchant's daughter from a border city, without silver at the edges of her eyes, and without the old script in her throat, and without the network's pulse in her awareness, the way you feel a fire in a cold room. She had known this since she read the passage in the vault. She had not told Vaeric the full weight of it, because the full weight of it was hers to carry, and the morning had not allowed for extended accounting. Line 38. She thought about what it meant to choose to give something up that had arrived in you without your choice, and had changed everything, and had shown you the size of what you were. There was a version of this moment that was grief, that understood the loss as a diminishment, a return to something smaller than what you had briefly become. She had spent 3 months in a court that regarded her as insufficient and peripheral. She had stood at an altar in silver chains and refused to beg. She had read 40 pages of ancient text in a language she had not known 6 hours earlier. She had told a king what he needed to hear instead of what he wanted to, at every point at which the two had diverged. That was not the divine element. That was hers. Whatever she was before the eclipse and after the barrier, the part that had looked at Vaeric Draven from an altar and told him to carry the weight, that remained. Line 39. Behind her, Voss said, "The dissolution is moving again." She heard it herself. The gap in the floor beginning to widen, the slow resumption of the subtraction process as the partial network's resistance reached its limit. The equilibrium had held for 4 minutes. It was ending now with the finality of things that do not negotiate their conclusions. Line 40. The foundation room's eastern wall began its dissolution, stone by stone, the same patient subtraction. And through the widening space where the wall had been, not darkness, something that had no color the human eye was built to process, a visual quality that the mind registered as absence while the body registered as the deepest cold it had ever encountered, colder than winter, colder than stone. The cold of something that had never been warm because warmth was a property it did not carry. The dissolution was large, not in the way that physical things were large, in the way that weather was large, that a storm was large, not bounded by a surface or a shape, but present in every direction that faced it, filling the space available to it with the same completeness that water fills a container. Selene looked at it. Not for long. Line 41. The dissolution reached the edge of the foundation room's flagged floor. It stopped there. The network's partial resistance, even at its limit, holding the absolute boundary of the room for the seconds that remained. Seconds. Selene read line 42. The old script left her throat and entered the network, and the network answered with the totality of a thing that had been waiting for this completion since the night the temples went dark 200 years ago. All 12 nodes simultaneously, the relay architecture completing its circuit, the barrier configuration assembling in the space between the network's outermost points, with the clean inevitability of a structure that had been designed for exactly this moment and had been waiting in its incomplete state across 2 centuries for the moment to arrive. The barrier sealed, not with sound, not with light, or rather with a light so complete and so fast that it existed and completed itself in the same instant, present and gone between one heartbeat and the next, leaving behind not darkness but the ordinary quality of morning air and stone and an oil lamp that had gone out, and a foundation room with a cracked floor and an eastern wall that was missing most of its upper section. The dissolution was gone, not defeated, not destroyed. Sealed out, present beyond the barrier's perimeter as surely as it had been present 60 seconds ago, but unable to cross what the network had become. The text's word for it was permanent, and Selene believed the text, and the believing felt like setting down something she had not known she was holding. She stood in the foundation room with the 42 lines completed and the ancient text open in her hands, and the silver gone from the edges of her eyes. Gone cleanly, gone completely. The absence of it was not a wound. It was a fact, the way all permanent things are facts once they have settled, not requiring an emotional response, simply requiring acknowledgement. She looked at the text. She could still see the old script on the page. She could not read it. The fluency was gone with everything else, returned to the network where it had come from, and what remained on the page was marks in a language she had spoken for 3 hours in the middle of a night that had changed the shape of everything and would never be accessible to her again in the same way. She closed the text. She looked at Voss. He was standing at the entrance to the foundation room with an expression she had not seen on his face in the hours since they left the council chamber. Not the controlled presentation of 20 years of strategic positioning, not the recalibrating calculation of a plan adjusting to circumstances. Something older than any of that. The expression of a man at the end of a very long accounting who is not certain what the balance shows. "It held," he said. "Yes." He looked at the space where the eastern wall had been. At the morning sky visible through the gap, the sun properly over the city's eastern rooflines now, the amber pre-dawn resolved into the clear, hard light of a morning that had decided to be ordinary despite everything. "The dissolution," he said. "Sealed out. Permanent." A long pause. "My estate," he said, looking at the separated wall stones and the cracked floor with the expression of a man looking at the debris of something that was his and is no longer what it was. Selene said nothing for a moment. Then, "You spent 15 years finding the 12th node." "Yes." "And you built the estate above it to protect the access." "The node needed to be in private hands," he said. "If the palace administration had found it, Aldrich would have controlled it." A fractional pause. "Yes." "The manufactured dormancy. The famine, the soulless births, the rivers." "That was Aldrich's work," Voss said. "His method, not mine. I knew about it. I didn't stop it." He met her eyes. "That's on me. The knowing and not stopping is the same as the doing, and I understood that and chose the plan anyway, and I have not found a version of accounting for it that is not what it is." Selene looked at him for a long moment. "The council will hear all of it," she said. "Yes. And the kingdom will decide." "Yes," he said again. She picked up the 3 texts and walked past him toward the estate's upper level and the morning. The North Gate situation had resolved itself by the time Selene reached the street, not quickly and not cleanly. The kind of resolution that happens when the calculus of an attacking force changes mid-engagement, when the intelligence the attack was built on proves inaccurate, and the command structure that would normally course-correct is no longer available to course-correct it. The Crimson Fang Legion's advance column had lost its command element 23 minutes into the engagement at the North Gate. How exactly was something the survivors would reconstruct in pieces over the following weeks? A figure at the front of a small force who went straight through the column's center rather than engaging its edges, who moved through the command cluster with the specific directed violence of someone who had identified the critical node and was not interested in anything else, who fought with the efficiency of a man operating past the point where survival is the primary concern because the arithmetic of what needed to happen had produced a number that required it. Vaeric Draven had 3 separate blade wounds by the time the advance column's command element was gone. 2 of them were scoring cuts, the left forearm from Voss's blade, still bleeding from before, joined now by a matching cut on the right shoulder from someone in the command cluster who had been faster than expected. The third was not a scoring cut. The third was a hand's width below his left ribs, from a blade that had found the gap between armor plates in the specific way that blades find those gaps when the engagement is close enough that technique becomes secondary to reach, and the person with the longer reach wins on that exchange. He knew it was serious from the quality of the pain, not the sharp immediate pain of a surface wound, but the deeper spreading pain of something that had reached an interior. He did not stop. The advance column, without command cohesion, does not immediately become a passive force. 20,000 soldiers carry their own momentum and their own fear and their own calculation about what the morning had turned into, and the recalibration of that calculation takes time, during which the momentum continues. Vaeric and the 14 clan soldiers and the clean garrison held the gate for the 11 minutes it took for the Crimson Fang's main force to receive the news that their advance column's command element was gone, and the gate was not open, and the king they had been told was contained was demonstrably not contained. 11 minutes. Then the horn pattern changed. The withdrawal signal. Not a retreat in the panicked sense, an organized pullback, the Crimson Fang executing the kind of tactical withdrawal that a professional force executes when the operational parameters have changed and the current engagement is no longer serving the mission. The mission had been built on the intelligence that a political transition in the capital was imminent, and the force's arrival would be timed to the transition rather than opposed to it. The political transition had not occurred. The timing intelligence was wrong. The advance column had encountered resistance of a kind and quality that the briefings had not described. The Crimson Fang withdrew. They would not withdraw from the kingdom. 20,000 soldiers at a border were still 20,000 soldiers, and the diplomatic and military work of managing their presence would occupy months. But they withdrew from the morning's specific ambition, and in the immediate arithmetic of the capital's survival, the withdrawal was sufficient. Vaeric was sitting against the inner gate wall when Kiev found him. Sitting because standing had become a calculation that was costing more than it returned, and he had spent 20 years making honest calculations, and this was an honest calculation. His hand was pressed against the wound below his ribs. The blood was coming through the armor's gap and between his fingers and pooling on the flagged courtyard stone beneath him, in the matter-of-fact way that blood pools when the body is doing what bodies do, and no one has had the chance to intervene yet. Kiev took one look and started shouting for the garrison medics. Vaeric said, "The barrier." Kiev stopped shouting long enough to look at him. "Did it seal?" Vaeric said. "I don't know, my king. I've been—" "The dissolution. Did it reach the city?" Kiev looked at the sky, at the morning light on the city's northern quarter where the first temple stood. The temple was intact. The silver glow that had been present in its upper windows since the eclipse was gone, replaced by the ordinary appearance of very old stone in morning light. "I don't think so," Kiev said. Vaeric looked at his hand against his ribs. He thought about the mate bond. It was there, he could feel it. Not the full pressing warmth of the past hours, not the sharp-edged urgency of the barrier's activation, but present, quieter. The way a fire is present when it has burned down to coals. Not the active combustion of the hours before, but the sustained, reliable heat of something that has settled into permanence. She was alive. He held that. The medic arrived and began the work of determining what the wound below his ribs actually was and what it required, and Vaeric submitted to the assessment with the pragmatic cooperation of someone who understands that the body is a tool and tools require maintenance. The medic's face during the assessment told him the thing the medic's words were being careful not to say directly, which was that the wound was serious in the way that required immediate attention and would produce a significant recovery period and would have produced a different conversation entirely if the blade had found a slightly different angle. He had been in this conversation before, not with this specific wound, but with the category Stulk, the post-engagement accounting, where the blade work had been close and the arithmetic of the outcome had margins that did not invite dwelling on. He had always filed those margins and moved to the next decision. He filed this one. "Where is she?" he said to Kiev. Kiev, who had been watching the medic with the expression of someone tracking the severity assessment, looked at him. "I'll find out." He found out in 3 minutes. A runner from the Ashvale escort that had been tracking the Voss estate situation. The estate was standing, partially. The barrier had sealed. The dissolution was gone. Voss was in custody of the Ashvale guard pending the council session. And Selene Vaelor was walking toward the north gate. Not running. Walking. Vaeric processed this and told the medic to do what needed to be done before he moved, because the window between serious wound requiring immediate attention and serious wound that has been left too long was not wide, and he intended to respect the arithmetic of it, even if the arithmetic was inconvenient. The medic worked for 14 minutes. The packing and binding that followed was not comfortable. Vaeric sat with it and did not display the discomfort because displaying it served nothing. and the medic was already moving with the urgency that the situation warranted without requiring encouragement. When it was done, he stood. Kaev said, "My king, the medic said—" "I heard the medic," Vaeric said. "I need to stand up. After that I will do what the medic said." He stood. The wound made itself known clearly and specifically through the binding, in the way that properly treated serious wounds make themselves known, present, insistent, non-negotiable in their claim on his awareness. He acknowledged it and moved. He was 15 feet from the gate when it opened from the outside. Selene came through it. She was carrying the 3 ancient texts under one arm, and her silver silk from the ritual was ruined, stained with dust from the foundation room and marked at the hem with the dissolution's proximity effect, which had blanched the fabric in a pattern that looked like frost and would not wash out. Her hair was down, the formal arrangement of the ritual having been abandoned somewhere in the vault or the foundation room, and her face had the quality of deep tiredness that is not the same as defeat, the tiredness of someone who has spent everything they had in a direction that mattered and is now arriving at the place where the spending is done. She saw him. She saw his hand at his side where the medic had bound the wound. She saw the blood on the armor that the binding had not cleaned. She saw the left forearm and the right shoulder, and the gate behind him where the Crimson Fang withdrawal had left its evidence in the form of abandoned equipment, and the courtyard stones that the morning light was making very specific about. She stopped 3 feet from him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from the altar, fully, without the management of a gaze, the kind of looking that does not arrange itself for the person being looked at. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable." That's not a medical assessment. The medic's assessment was more detailed. I'll share it when there's time. Her jaw moved slightly. Not quite an expression, the beginning of one that she interrupted. "The barrier sealed." "I felt it," he said. "The dissolution is gone," she said. "Permanently." The text was accurate. He held her gaze. The mate bond between them was doing the quiet, settled thing it had been doing since he felt her alive through the courtyard wall, and he was not going to manage it. He had run out of the version of himself that managed it and was standing in the version that came after, and this version was less controlled and more honest and hurt, more in the specific way that honesty hurts when you have been performing a different version of yourself for long enough that the performance has left marks. "The divine element," he said. She looked at him steadily. "It's done," she said. He absorbed this. He looked at her eyes, looking specifically for the silver that had been present at their edges since the eclipse, that had been present during the vault reading and the council chamber and the walk through the palace corridors in the pre-dawn. It was not there. Her eyes were the same color they had been the night they met. The first formal introduction in the court chamber with the 100 witnesses and the practice ceremony, and the moment when she looked at him across the formal distance with an expression that he had filed as composed, and was now reading, retroactively, as someone deciding to be patient with circumstances that did not merit patience. He had not looked at her properly then. He had been managing the mate bond's arrival, and managing the court's observation, and managing his own response to the unexpected completeness of the pull he felt toward her. And in all that managing, he had not looked. He looked now. "You knew the full cost of it before you went," he said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me. You had a north gate and 20,000 soldiers and 3 separate wounds to manage. The accounting for what I was doing was mine." "It was also mine." She looked at him without flinching from the directness of that. "Yes," she said. "It was also yours. And I made the decision without you. That's accurate." "Are you going to tell me why?" A pause. Not the selection pause he had come to recognize. Something more personal than that. "Because I needed to make one decision in the past 24 hours that was entirely mine," she said. "Without being told what it required and without being given the chain and without being the mechanism in someone else's plan." She held his gaze. "Including yours." The sentence sat between them. He felt it land in the exact place it was aimed. She was not wrong. He had made the decision at the council chamber. Her to the Voss estate for the barrier, him to the North Gate for the Legion. It had been the right decision. It had also been his decision, delivered as the operational necessity it was. And she had accepted it as the operational necessity it was. and neither of those things made it a choice she had been given rather than a direction she had been given. The pattern was familiar. He had been running the pattern for 20 years because the pattern worked, because it produced outcomes, because the empire had survived and expanded and held under the governance of a king who made clean decisions and implemented them with the efficiency of someone who did not second-guess the math. The math was accurate. The cost accounting was incomplete. "I hear you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "That's the first time," she said, "that you've said something to me that wasn't also a position." "I know." "What changed?" He considered the question with the honesty it deserved, because she had earned the honest version of everything at this point, and he was done offering her the managed versions. "I watched you walk into the vault and read a language you'd never learned," he said. "I watched you stand in my council chamber and translate ancient texts in front of 40 witnesses without performing it or asking me whether it was the right approach. I watched you tell me what the barrier activation cost, and then do it anyway because it needed to be done." He paused. "And I went through the north gate with 14 soldiers, and I wasn't certain I was coming back. And the thing I thought about wasn't the empire or the decision calculus or the arithmetic of what the morning required." Selene was very still. "It was you," he said, "at the altar. Not the eclipse and not the divine element and not what you became afterward. You, before any of that. The way you looked at me and told me to carry it. I've been carrying it since. It doesn't get lighter." She was quiet for a long time. Around them, the gate courtyard was gradually filling with the aftermath of the morning. Clan soldiers, garrison elements, the medics team moving among those who needed them. The ordinary managed chaos of a situation transitioning from crisis to response. No one came close to where they were standing, whether by instruction or instinct. The people around them had understood that this particular 4 feet of the courtyard was not available for the general foot traffic of the morning. "The Empire survived," Selene said finally. "Yes." "Not because of the sacrifice," she said. "The texts were clear about that. The ritual was activation, not salvation. The salvation was the barrier, and the barrier required all 12 nodes. And the 12th node was only findable because Voss spent 15 years looking for it, and it was only activatable because of what the eclipse produced." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the Empire survived because of a series of things that were not the decision you made at the altar," she said. "Which means the decision you made at the altar was just a decision. Made on incomplete information, with the Empire's survival as the justification, and the Empire would have survived through a different path if the decision had been different." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "That doesn't make it right." "No." "It also doesn't make it irredeemable," she said. "Those are different things, and I've spent the past several hours determining which one it is." His breathing was careful around the wound. "And?" She looked at him with the expression that was not the assessment look and was not the operational look, the one he had almost no data on, that he was gathering data on now with the attention of someone who intends to have significantly more data on it going forward. "You went through the gate," she said. "Yes." "With 14 people?" "Yes." "To break the command element of a 20,000 force advance column. The arithmetic required it." "The arithmetic," she said, "required you to go through the center of a 20,000 force with 14 people. And you did it." "I've done similar things before." "I know," she said. "I have 200 years of governance memory, and every one of those kings would have sent the 14 people and stood on a wall and called it strategic prudence." A pause. "You went through the gate. It was necessary. It was also—" She stopped, looked at his hand at the wound. "You were going to say something." "I was going to say it was the right call," he said. "And then I was going to say that the right call and the call I would have made 3 days ago are not the same call, and I'm not certain when they diverged." Selene looked at him. 3 months ago," she said. "That's when they diverged. The night you were told the ritual was required and you started, not protecting the kingdom from the information, protecting yourself from the decision. Because you already knew, at some level, that it was the wrong thing, and the managing was how you avoided sitting with knowing it." He did not argue with this. He had enough honesty left this morning to recognize the shape of it. "What do you want?" he said. not what the kingdom requires, not the council session, or the Voss accounting, or the Legion situation. What do you want? She held his gaze for a long, complete moment. I want, she said, to sit down somewhere that isn't a council chamber, or a vault, or a foundation room, with something that isn't an ancient text, and I want to talk to you the way two people talk when they're not managing a crisis together. He looked at her. That's what I want, she said. And then I want to see what's left after that, because I don't know yet. I know the Empire survived, and I know the barrier is sealed, and I know Aldrich will account for what he did, and Voss will account for what he did, and the Crimson Fang will eventually go home. I know all the things that the morning resolved. She paused. I don't know yet what we are. The mate bond between them was the sustained, reliable warmth of coals, not the consuming intensity of the eclipse's peak, not the sharp urgency of crisis proximity. Something older feeling than both of those. The kind of warmth that does not require tending because it has settled into the state it intends to maintain. We're beginning, he said. She looked at him steadily. That's a very specific claim, she said. Yes. Made by a man who spent 3 months not looking at me. I'm looking now. A long pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, not the performing of warmth, but the thing that is underneath warmth when a person has decided to stop being careful about it. You need to see the medic properly, she said, before any of the rest of it. I saw the medic. You saw the medic for 14 minutes at the gate wall between standing up and walking over here. That's not seeing the medic properly. Are you managing my recovery? I'm pointing out that the arithmetic of a serious wound left insufficiently treated produces an outcome that is not useful to either of us. She looked at him with the directness that had been present since the altar, since before the altar, since the first time she looked at him across a formal dinner and decided to be patient with circumstances that did not merit patience. Go see the medic. I'll be here. Something in his chest that was not the wound and was not the mate bond, or was both, or was the place where the two occupied the same space, eased. It was not comfortable, exactly. The history of the past 24 hours did not become comfortable through the resolution of its worst urgencies. There was still the council session to come, still the accounting for Voss and Aldrich, still the Crimson Fang at the border, and the diplomatic work that would require months. Still the 11 waking temples across the kingdom that now existed in a condition the kingdom's governance structure had no precedent for addressing. Still, all of it. And underneath all of it, the mate bond. Not pulling, not aching, not the managed distance of 3 months, or the consuming intensity of the eclipse, or the sharp urgency of crisis. Present, grounded. The way fundamental things are present when they have stopped being negotiated and have simply become the organizing fact of a life. He went to see the medic. The medic's actual opinion of the wound, delivered without the compression of the gate courtyard's time pressure, was more detailed and more emphatic than the gate wall version. The blade had found the space between the armor plates and reached the left side's lower abdominal region and had done damage that would require 3 weeks of restricted activity and 2 months of full recovery and would be a source of specific complaint for significantly longer than that. Vaeric absorbed all of this with the pragmatic cooperation of someone who has been told the parameters of a situation and is determining how to operate within them. Can I stand for 2 hours? He said. The medic looked at him. The council session, Vaeric said. With the binding, yes, the medic said. If you sit when the session structure allows it, it will allow it. And after the session, I will do exactly what you've told me, Vaeric said, with specificity and without argument. The medic appeared to weigh the probability of this promise against the alternative, which was arguing with the Alpha King about it in a gate courtyard with an audience. After the session, the medic said. The council session convened at midday. Every member of the council, every Alpha clan head in the capital, the foreign emissaries, the noble houses whose representatives had been in the gallery the night before, Bretta's Ashvale guard at every entrance, Kaev at Vaeric's left shoulder. Voss stood before the assembled chamber and gave his accounting. It took 2 hours. He spoke without the controlled presentation of 20 years of strategic positioning. He spoke in the flat, careful voice of someone who has decided that accuracy is the only thing remaining that is worth the effort. And accuracy in this case required specificity about decisions and their effects, and the people who had relied on the governance structure those decisions corrupted. The famines, the soulless births, the rivers, all of it. The chamber was very quiet throughout. Not the quiet of acceptance, the quiet of people absorbing something that changes the retroactive shape of 20 years and requires time to reconstruct. The quiet of those who had governed alongside a corruption they had not seen and were now sitting with the implications of not seeing it. Aldrich was brought in under Ashvale guard partway through. He had been found in the Voss estate's intact west section, which had survived the dissolution's partial reach, sitting at a table with several of the texts that he had spent 20 years controlling access to. He was brought in without ceremony, and he stood before the chamber with the expression of a man who had already made his accounting privately and was now prepared to make it publicly. His accounting was shorter than Voss's, more complete. He named specific decisions, specific falsifications, specific moments at which the translation of the ancient texts had been adjusted to produce the outcomes the plan required. He named the dormancy induction process, and the specific mechanism and the timeline. He named the communication channels to the Voss estate and the nature of those communications. He named the moment he understood that the vessel had read the full texts. "She was faster than I expected," he said to the chamber. Not with bitterness, with the accuracy that was all he had left. The full activation sequence in the time available. I calculated she would need the rest of the night, and we would have the morning. She completed it before dawn. The chambers assembled looked at Selene, who was seated at the dais. She did not look back at them. She was looking at the text on the table in front of her. The first volume, the one she had carried from the vault through the night and into the estate foundation room and back out through the morning. The one whose script she could no longer read. She was looking at it the way you look at something that was yours and is not yours in the same way anymore. Not grief, not loss, not the performing of either. Simply acknowledgement, the full honest registration of what had changed. The council's deliberation on Voss and Aldrich lasted the remainder of the day. It produced a verdict at dusk. Not Vaeric's verdict, not the clan head's verdict, but the assembled chamber's verdict, which was the thing Vaeric had told Voss it would be when the morning's crisis was still in progress. And the promise had been the only currency available. Voss would spend a year in the capital under council supervision, accountable to the governing body he had spent 20 years working to control, his estates and resources subject to the reparation process that the affected territories would determine. The minor houses he had gathered were given the opportunity to account for their own involvement before witnesses, and most of them took it. Aldrich would leave the kingdom, not execution, exile. The determination of the council that a man who had lived inside the governance structure for 20 years and corrupted it systematically was not someone whose continued presence in the kingdom's institutional fabric served the kingdom's recovery. He was given 3 days. He used 2 of them. The evening after the council session, the palace's north garden was quiet in the specific way that places become quiet after sustained noise. The quiet that feels like the absence of something rather than simply the presence of stillness. Selene was there when Vaeric came. Not looking for her specifically, he had been told by Breda, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a clan head who had spent the day managing security at an extended council session, that the Queen's mate had last been seen walking toward the north garden, and that she had been walking without the Ashvale escort, and that Breda had made a judgment call about whether the escort was necessary given the barrier's permanent seal and had decided it was not. He walked through the garden's entrance and found her at the northern edge, where the path ended at a low stone wall, and beyond the wall, the city extended toward the first temple's restored structure, standing dark against the evening sky. The ancient stone without the silver glow now, simply stone, old and present in the way that things are present when they have been restored to their original condition rather than elevated to something they were never intended to be. She was not reading. She did not have the texts. She was looking at the temple the way he had watched her look at the ancient script, with the full, unmanaged attention of someone who is looking at a thing and letting it be what it is. He came to stand beside her. He had done what he told the medic he would do. The wound was bound properly and would heal in its timeline, and he was standing at the cost of the specific discomfort that a properly bound serious wound produces, which was manageable and which he was not pretending was not present. They stood in the garden for a while without speaking. This was different from the silences of the past 24 hours, not the silences of two people in crisis proximity who are processing too many things for speech, not the silence of the council chamber absorbing difficult accounting. The silence of two people who have arrived somewhere after a long transit and are sitting with the arrival. The first temple, Selene said, is going to need governance structure. All 11 of them, Vaeric said. The kingdom has no precedent for it. The kingdom has no precedent for most of what happened in the past 24 hours. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the closest thing to a laugh he had heard from her since the night began, and it had the texture of something returning to a space it had been absent from. Not dramatic, not performed, just present. There are people in the clan territories, she said, who maintain the old practices even after the temples went cold. The Ashvale clan has 3 of them. The Drumora have 1. They've been, she paused. Bretta told me. She said the clan elders have been tending what they could tend without the network active, keeping the old knowledge in circulation even without the infrastructure for it. You want to find them. I want to give the temple governance to people who've been doing the work without the recognition, she said. Not appoint a new seer order, not build another institutional structure with exclusive interpretive authority. She looked at him. The seer's model is what produced Aldrich. The clan elders model is informal. It doesn't have the administrative capacity. We build the administrative capacity around it, she said, not over it. The knowledge goes with the people who've been keeping it. He absorbed this. The operational register in which he had been living for 20 years processed it as a governance proposal with several implementation challenges and significant potential for territorial conflict over temple jurisdictions between clan territories and the central administration. He processed it as those things. He also processed it as the proposal of someone who had spent the past 24 hours inside a governance failure, catastrophic enough to demonstrate with specificity what institutional monopoly on ancient knowledge costs a kingdom across 20 years. I'll need the clan heads to agree on jurisdiction parameters, he said. Bretta already has opinions about that, she said. I imagine she does. Another silence, easier than the ones before. The Crimson Fang, she said, will be at the border for the season. The diplomatic process will take 3 months minimum. Who leads the negotiation? I had a general for that, he said. His position is currently under review. You need someone who reads the Crimson Fang's political structure accurately and doesn't have a prior alignment with Voss's network. I need several people like that, he said. I'm learning that I've been using a narrower pool of advisors than I understood. She looked at him sideways, not the full-on assessment look, the thing that lived at the edge of it. That's a significant admission, she said. I'm working on being accurate, he said. You told me honesty arrived late. I'm trying to make the late arrival count for something. She looked back at the temple. It counts, she said. The evening was settling into the particular quality of late dusk that this city produced. The way the light went amber and then deep blue over the eastern roof lines. The way the lamplighters moved through the streets below the garden wall in their regular evening pattern. The ordinary continuation of a city's life after a night that had changed its shape permanently. The permanence was the thing Vaeric kept returning to, in the quiet of the garden and the aftermath of the day. Not the changes themselves. Change was the baseline condition of governing, was always the condition of any living thing, but the specific permanence of the barrier's seal. The dissolution sealed out, permanently. The word from the ancient text sitting in his awareness with the weight of something that did not require revisitation. 20 years of governing a kingdom through catastrophe after catastrophe, each one resolved and replaced by the next, the perpetual motion machine of a kingdom at the edge of itself. And at the other side of this particular morning, a permanent thing. He had not had many of those. He was sitting with it in the way you sit with something new to the category. The texts, he said. She looked at him. After the council has what it needs from them, the documentation, the translation for the official record, what do you want done with them? She thought about this. The vault, she said. Not the Seer's vault. A new system. Council accessible. Multiple translators. No single order with exclusive authority. The translation is the challenge. Without the divine access, yes. She said it without the weight he might have expected, simply acknowledging the parameter. There are scholars who've spent their lives on the old script from fragments. It's slow work and it's incomplete, but it's honest work. And honest incomplete is better than comprehensive falsified. He looked at her. You're not, he said carefully, performing acceptance of what you lost. She looked back at him with the direct quality that had been present since the altar, since before the altar. No, she said. I'm not. I know what it was, and I know it's gone, and I know what I did with it before it went. A pause. The performing would be the pretense that it wasn't significant. It was significant. It was the most significant thing that has ever happened to me. And I chose to use it to seal the barrier, and that choice is exactly as complete as the barrier is. Are you going to grieve it? I'm going to do whatever I actually do, she said, which I don't know yet, because it's been 10 hours since I completed the activation, and I've spent those 10 hours in a council chamber. She met his eyes. Ask me in a week. In a week, he said. She turned to look at him more fully. The evening light was doing what evening light does when it finds the right face in the right moment. Not flattering, not dramatic, simply present, making the specifics visible. The tiredness that was not defeat. The directness that had been there from the beginning. The silver that was not there anymore, because she had poured it into something permanent. The face of a merchant's daughter from a border city who had survived an altar, and a divine awakening in a foundation room where the dissolution reached the floor, and had walked out of all of it carrying 3 ancient texts in someone else's terms for the morning, and had still had things to say about how the temple governance should work. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask? In the gallery, she said, when I told you to carry it, you said you already knew you would. Yes. What did that mean to you at that moment? What you knew? He looked at the temple. He had been carrying the weight of the question since she asked it, and he had been carrying the weight of the night since the night, and the two weights were not separable. They were the same weight in different forms, the same acknowledgement arriving through different channels. It meant, he said, that I had made a decision I was not going to be able to govern around, that the thing I was managing, the distance, the bond, the calculation about what a king could and could not afford to let organize his decisions, was no longer available as a management strategy. He paused. Because you looked at me from an altar and didn't close your eyes and told me to carry it, and I understood in that moment that I was already carrying everything you were. He looked at her. I just hadn't stopped pretending I wasn't. Selene looked at him for a long time. The mate bond between them was quiet and certain and entirely unhurried. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me, she said. I'm aware. It's still insufficient. I know. Insufficient and honest is a better starting point than sufficient and managed, she said. Yes. She turned back to the first temple. He stood beside her. The kingdom below the garden wall went about its evening. Lamps lit. Voices carried upward from the streets in the ordinary register of people at the end of a day. A city that had collapsed twice in the past 30 years, at the border wars and at the night of the Blood Eclipse, and had rebuilt and had discovered this morning that 20 years of its suffering had been deliberately induced and would have to decide across the weeks and months of the accounting that was only beginning what it intended to do with that knowledge. Not easy work. Not clean work. The work of a kingdom that had survived something and was now required to be honest about what it was surviving toward. Vaeric had spent 20 years building an empire on the premise that the survival itself was sufficient, that the holding of territory and the maintenance of borders and the prevention of the collapse that had taken every predecessor kingdom in the region, that these were the measure. He was revising the premise. Not because the survival was insufficient, survival was necessary, was the precondition for everything else, and he was not going to perform a retrospective contempt for 20 years of decisions that had kept the kingdom intact. But survival was the floor, not the ceiling. The ceiling was the question of what you built on the floor, and what you built on it was the question of what you thought it was for, And what you thought it was for was the question that Vaeric Draven had spent 20 years not asking clearly enough, and the answer to which was standing beside him in a north garden looking at a restored temple in the evening light, without silver at the edges of her eyes. An empire was not built to be held, it was built to be worth holding. The council session tomorrow, Selene said. The second session? Yes. The temple jurisdiction discussion. Bretta will make it contentious. Bretta will make it accurate, Shiskus, she said. Contentious and accurate aren't always different things. No, he said. They're often the same thing. She made the almost laugh sound again. It was easier the second time. He thought it might become easier with practice. He intended to provide significant opportunity for practice. The evening deepened around them. The city's lamps multiplied below the garden wall until the streets were a version of the eclipse's silver light rendered in ordinary fire. 1,000 small sources producing collectively what the eclipse had produced in one vast moment. Different in scale, different in nature, continuous in the way that ordinary light is continuous rather than singular. He thought about permanence, about the barrier sealed in the network of 12 nodes across a kingdom that had spent 20 years under deliberate corruption and would spend the next 20 years in the process of understanding what it was without that corruption organizing its parameters. About the dissolution sealed out, about the things that were not sealed but were present, the wound in his side, which the medic had been accurate about, and the months of its healing ahead. The diplomatic work of the Crimson Fang, the reparation process for the territories that the manufactured famines had broken, the temple governance structure that had to be built from people who had maintained the old knowledge in the margins, the council's evolution towards something less susceptible to the Aldrich failure mode. All of it ahead. None of it clean. All of it. And this was the thing he had not let himself think clearly for 20 years, which was itself a kind of corruption, the private corruption of a king who had convinced himself that what he was doing and what he wanted were different categories, all of it worth doing. Not because the empire required it, because she was going to be in it. He looked at her profile against the darkening sky, the ordinary light of the city catching the ordinary color of her eyes. And he thought about what it meant that he had spent 3 months carefully not looking and had arrived at an altar and a broken chain and a 12th temple and a north gate and a council chamber and a garden in the same 24 hours that had destroyed everything he thought he was managing. He thought about how destruction and arrival were sometimes the same event, arrived at from different angles. Selene, he said. She looked at him. I'm going to be different at this than I was at everything else I've built, he said. Slower. Less certain about what the right call is. More likely to be wrong about things I would have been confident about before. She looked at him steadily. That's not a warning, she said. No. It's a description. Yes. Of the person you're becoming. Of the person I'm finding under the person I've been performing, he said. They're not entirely different. Some of what I was is what I am, but the parts I managed away. The parts I filed and governed around. He held her gaze. I'm done governing around them. The mate bond was the quiet coal warmth of a thing that had decided to be permanent. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and put her hand against his jaw. Not cupping it, not pulling him toward her. Flat, steady contact, the way she had put her palm on the dais table, and the barrier had begun to seal, complete and unhurried. You went through the gate, she said again. Yes. You didn't have to. The arithmetic of the situation didn't actually require the king to go through the gate personally. You know that. He held her gaze. I know, he said. Why did you? Because the king who goes through the gate is different from the king who sends the 14 people, he said. And I've been trying to determine, since the night you told me to carry what I'd done, which one was worth being. She looked at him. Her hand was still against his jaw, the contact certain and specific and entirely without performance. The one who goes through the gate, she said. Yes, is also the one who needs to see the medic properly. He made a sound that was, barely, under 20 years of training against it, a laugh. She made the almost laugh again, and this time it completed itself. And in the north garden of a palace that had survived a night. It should not have survived. Above a city that was relearning what it was built for, beside a temple that had come back from 200 years of deliberate darkness. The Alpha King who had built an empire on the premise that power was the point, and the merchant's daughter who had looked at him from an altar without closing her eyes, stood in the ordinary evening light, and were neither a king and a goddess, nor a sacrifice and a ruler, but two people who had earned the right to be something simpler and more durable than either. The moon rose, ordinary silver, no eclipse, no divine weight, no cosmic signal regarding the fate of kingdoms, just the moon, doing what it had always done, present above the city the way the city was present below it, continuous, unhurried, indifferent to the human accounting of what a night had cost and what it had produced, indifferent in the way that permanent things are indifferent to the temporary urgencies of those who live beneath them. The empire survived, not because of sacrifice, because two people, on opposite sides of an altar, and 3 months of managed distance, and 24 hours of a morning that kept breaking open new damage, had arrived at the same decision from different directions. To stop managing it. To let it be what it was. To find out, in the ordinary continuity of the evenings that followed this one, what that turned out to mean.